I had always dreamed of moving out of the city and into a quiet neighborhood. After years of cramped apartments, I finally found a two-story house in rural Pennsylvania. It was an older home built in the late 1960s with faded white siding and a small front porch. The backyard was overgrown, filled with wild grass and towering oak trees that cast long shadows across the property. The house needed some work, but it was affordable, and I convinced myself I could handle the repairs. The first night I spent there, I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. I had grown used to the constant hum of traffic, the distant wail of sirens, and neighbors arguing through thin walls. Here, the silence pressed against me like a physical weight. I attributed it to the rural setting and went to sleep. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of creaking floorboards. At first, I thought it was the house settling, but the noises were deliberate, slow, methodical steps across the living room. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was just my imagination and rolled over. Then I heard a soft sigh. It was close, almost at my bedroom door. I froze, gripping the blanket, praying it would stop. The next morning, nothing seemed out of place. The doors were locked, windows closed, and I didn't see any signs of forced entry. I tried to convince myself I had dreamed it, but over the next few nights, the sounds returned. Footsteps pacing the hallway, whispered voices that seemed to come from inside the walls. Objects moved from where I left them. My keys would vanish from the kitchen counter, only to reappear on the dining table. A picture frame I had propped on a shelf would be turned to face the wall. One night, I woke to a cold draft sweeping through the bedroom. I sat up, shivering, and saw the bedroom door slowly creak open. I reached for my phone, but it was dead. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the far end of the hallway, tall, indistinct, and impossibly still. I didn't move. After a few moments, the figure faded into the darkness. My hands trembled so badly I could barely grab a flashlight. I started researching the house's history. Records showed frequent turnover in ownership. No one stayed longer than a few years. I managed to contact a previous tenant, a woman in her 60s. Her voice trembled when I explained the occurrences. She said, "You need to leave before it makes you stay." She hung up abruptly, leaving me unsettled. The disturbances grew worse. The basement, which I had barely explored, became a source of dread. I would hear the door creak open late at night. Heavy footsteps would ascend the stairs when I was alone. My dog refused to go near the basement, growling and backing away. One night, I woke to find muddy footprints stretching from the basement to my bedroom door. They stopped there. Eventually, I tried recording the house at night with cameras. Nothing ever appeared on the footage, but the noises persisted, louder, more distinct. Whispers that sounded like a conversation I couldn't understand. Laughter echoing through empty rooms, cold spots in the hallways that made my skin crawl. One particularly terrifying night, I woke in the middle of the night and found myself standing in the basement. I have no idea how I got there. I don't sleepwalk. The air was freezing, damp, and heavy. In the far corner, I saw a shape. Dark, smoke-like, shifting, but unmistakably humanoid. It didn't move toward me, but I felt its gaze piercing me. I bolted up the stairs, tripping in the dark, and ran outside into the yard, gasping for air. I stayed at a motel for a week, too afraid to return. Every time I thought about the house, I felt a cold, oppressive weight in my chest. I eventually sold it at a loss, refusing to go back for the remaining items. Movers who retrieved my furniture reported the basement door wide open, though I had locked it. They found a small, old-fashioned key on the stairs, which I declined to take. Even now, months later, I still dream about that house. I hear the footsteps, the whispers, and sometimes I wake, certain I feel a cold draft sweeping across my room. I'll never understand what was in that house, but I know one thing for sure. Some houses are alive, and some of them don't want you there. Story the end. When my wife and I first pulled into the driveway of the house we'd eventually buy, I remember feeling a strange mixture of excitement and unease. It was the kind of house that had character, the kind that seemed like it should be photographed for a real estate magazine. 2 stories, pale blue siding with white trim, a large front porch, and a yard big enough for the dog we always talked about getting. It sat on the edge of a quiet suburban street in upstate New York, where the houses were spaced farther apart than in the city, giving everything a sense of privacy and peace. We had been looking for months, exhausted from open houses and bidding wars, and when this property came on the market, it felt like luck. The price was surprisingly affordable for the size. The realtor, a thin man in his late 40s with a fixed smile, told us the seller was motivated and wanted to move quickly. I didn't ask too many questions about why. The inside was charming, but dated. Creaky hardwood floors, floral wallpaper in some of the rooms, and an old-fashioned kitchen that would need renovating. But we were both instantly drawn to it. I'll never forget the way my wife, Jenna, smiled as she stood in the living room, sunlight pouring through the bay window onto her face. She whispered, "This feels like home." That was all I needed. We put in an offer the same day, and by some miracle, it was accepted without a counter. We closed within a month. The first few days were filled with that blissful chaos of moving. Boxes everywhere, takeout containers stacked on counters, the two of us tripping over each other as we tried to unpack. The house smelled faintly musty, like it had been shut up for too long, but we chalked it up to being empty for months. I lit candles, and Jenna opened every window to let the spring air in. At night, the house was quiet, far quieter than the city apartments we'd lived in. It took some adjusting to the stillness, to the occasional creaks and groans of old wood settling. It wasn't until about the fourth night that things started to feel off. I woke up around 3 a.m. to what I thought was Jenna shifting beside me, but when I rolled over, she was sound asleep, her breathing steady. The sound I'd heard wasn't her. It had come from downstairs. It was a faint scraping noise, like furniture being dragged slowly across the floor. I froze, listening. After a few seconds, the noise stopped. I waited another minute before convincing myself it was nothing, probably the house creaking, or maybe I'd imagined it. Still, I couldn't shake the tension in my chest. I eventually dozed back off, but the next morning I felt groggy, uneasy. At breakfast, I asked Jenna if she'd heard anything during the night. She shook her head and laughed. "You're just not used to how quiet it is here. Every little noise feels huge." She wasn't wrong, and I let it go. But the noises continued. Every few nights, almost always around the same time, I'd wake to the sound of movement downstairs. Sometimes it was scraping, other times soft, deliberate footsteps across the hardwood. I tried to brush it off, but one night I finally worked up the nerve to get out of bed and check. The house was dark and cold, the air almost heavier on the first floor. I flicked on the living room light and saw nothing out of place. Everything was exactly where we'd left it. I checked the doors, the windows, all locked. I went back upstairs, embarrassed by the way my heart had been hammering. A week later, Jenna mentioned something strange. She'd been in the upstairs bathroom getting ready for work when she heard what she swore was someone walking through the hallway outside. She'd assumed it was me, but when she called out, I didn't answer. She opened the door and the hallway was empty. I had been outside in the yard at the time, raking leaves. I laughed it off at first, but the look on her face told me she was unsettled. "It wasn't just footsteps," she said. "It felt like someone was right there." That night, for the first time, she admitted she was having trouble sleeping. She felt like the house wasn't as warm as it should be, despite the furnace running. "It just doesn't feel welcoming," she whispered. I tried to reassure her, but deep down, I knew what she meant. The oddities escalated. One evening, while unpacking boxes in the basement, I noticed something peculiar. Behind a stack of old paint cans left by the previous owner was a narrow wooden door, almost hidden in the wall. It was smaller than a regular door, maybe 4 feet high, with a rusted latch. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled it open. A foul, earthy smell wafted out like damp soil and mildew. I shined my phone's flashlight inside. It was a crawl space, dark, low, with dirt flooring and cobwebs thick as curtains. At first glance, it looked empty, but when I crouched down, I noticed deep scratches in the wooden beams along the entryway. They weren't random either. They looked deliberate, carved with something sharp. I backed out quickly, shut the door, and tried not to think about it. But that night, I dreamt of being in that crawl space, crawling on my hands and knees in total darkness, something behind me, close enough that I could feel its breath on my neck. A few days later, Jenna brought up something that made my stomach sink. She said she'd started hearing whispers at night. At first, she thought it was me talking in my sleep, but one night she nudged me awake, and I was silent. She said the whispers were low, hushed, impossible to make out, but coming from somewhere in the room. I wanted to believe stress was playing tricks on us, but I couldn't explain the cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere, or why certain rooms felt heavier than others. The upstairs hallway, in particular, gave me chills. Every time I walked through it, I felt like someone was watching from the shadows. Then came the night we both woke to the sound of the basement door creaking open. It was unmistakable, the long, slow whine of the hinges. We sat up in bed at the same time, staring at each other, our faces pale in the dim light. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed and crept down the stairs. The basement door was wide open. I stood there, holding my breath, listening. The house was silent. I closed the door, locked it, and pushed a chair in front of it. Jenna didn't sleep at all that night. Neither did I. The following morning, I went down to the basement to check. The little crawlspace door was open. I knew for a fact I had shut it. That was when I finally called the realtor to ask some questions. At first, he was polite, evasive, but when I pressed harder, his tone changed. He admitted the house had been on the market several times over the past decade. Families would move in, stay for a year or two, then abruptly sell. He claimed he didn't know details, but he'd heard rumors that strange things happened in the house. That was all he said, but it was enough. From that point on, everything intensified. Doors we knew we had locked would be standing open. The dog we adopted refused to go near the basement door, barking and growling whenever we brought her close. Jenna started to change, too. She was withdrawn, tired all the time, as if the house was draining her. She said the whispers were louder now, clearer, though she still couldn't make out the words. One night while lying in bed, I finally heard them too. A low, urgent murmuring, like several voices overlapping, coming from the corner of the room. I sat up, straining to hear, and the voices stopped instantly, replaced by the sound of someone sighing, right next to my ear. I jumped out of bed, turned on every light, and refused to turn them off until morning. The last straw came a few weeks later. Jenna had been in the shower upstairs while I sat in the living room watching TV. I heard her scream, raw, terrified. I bolted upstairs, nearly slipping on the hardwood, and found her crouched in the corner of the bathroom, dripping wet, her eyes wide with terror. She said she'd seen someone in the mirror behind her. A man, tall, with dark, hollow eyes. He was standing in the doorway, watching her. When she spun around, the doorway was empty, but she swore she'd seen him clearly. That night, we packed bags and left. We stayed at a hotel for a week, too afraid to go back. Eventually, we returned only to grab essentials. The house felt darker than before, oppressive. In the basement, I checked the crawl space one last time. Inside, scratched into the dirt wall, were words I hadn't seen before. "Stay down here with me." I didn't tell Jenna what I saw. I just shut the door and left. We sold the house at a loss a few months later. I didn't care about the money anymore. I just wanted it out of our lives. But sometimes late at night, when the house we live in now is quiet, I swear I still hear that faint dragging sound as if something followed us. Story, the end. When we first moved into the house, I thought it was the best decision we had ever made. It was one of those big old American homes you see in real estate listings that make you feel like you found something special. 2 stories, pale gray siding, a wide front porch with railings that creaked when you leaned on them, and an attic that I imagined would be perfect for storage. It had history written all over it. The realtor mentioned it was built in the late 1920s, which I thought only added charm. My wife, Rachel, was a little hesitant about the idea of moving into such an old house, but I convinced her that it was worth it. The price was suspiciously low, and though she said that made her uneasy, I chalked it up to the fact that the place had been on the market for nearly a year. No one seemed to want it, but that was our gain. The first week was nothing out of the ordinary. We were too busy unpacking boxes and trying to figure out which rooms would be used for what. Our daughter, Lily, who was 6, immediately claimed the room at the end of the hall upstairs. She liked it because it had a window seat that overlooked the backyard. She spent hours sitting there, reading picture books and staring at the line of trees behind our property. I remember being relieved that she adjusted so quickly. Moving at that age isn't easy for kids. At night, though, things felt different. The first few nights, I woke up around 3 a.m. without any reason. I'd lie there staring at the ceiling, listening. The house was noisier than I expected. Old pipes groaned, the wood creaked under its own weight, and sometimes I thought I heard faint knocking sounds coming from somewhere downstairs. Rachel told me I was just on edge because it was a new environment. I believed her. At least I did at first. On our fourth night, Rachel shook me awake. It was past midnight, and she whispered that she heard footsteps in the hallway. I listened, straining my ears, and for a few seconds, I heard it too. A slow, deliberate creak, like someone was walking down the hall outside our bedroom. I immediately thought of Lily and sat up, ready to go check. But when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. Lily's door was closed, and I pushed it open quietly to make sure she was asleep. She was, curled up with her stuffed rabbit, breathing evenly. Nothing seemed wrong. I went back to bed, telling Rachel it was probably the house settling, but the uneasiness in her eyes mirrored what I was feeling inside. The following morning, Lily asked me a strange question. Over breakfast, while she picked at her cereal, she asked, "Daddy, who was talking in the hallway last night?" I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth. I asked her what she meant, and she said, "I heard a man's voice. He was whispering. I think he was looking for something." She said it with such casual honesty that it sent a chill down my spine. Rachel quickly told her she must have been dreaming, but the way Lily frowned made me think she didn't believe that explanation. After that, small things kept happening. The kind of things you could dismiss individually, but together, they started to build a picture that was hard to ignore. A glass fell off the kitchen counter when no one was near it. Doors that we knew we had shut were found open in the morning. The attic door, which had one of those pull-down ladders, was particularly strange. It wasn't locked, but it was heavy, and neither Rachel nor I had been up there yet. One morning I noticed it wasn't fully closed, as though someone had tugged it down slightly and forgotten to push it back up. I told myself it was probably from air pressure changes, but the excuse felt flimsy even as I said it in my own head. Then came the night Lily woke up screaming. Rachel and I ran into her room, hearts racing to find her sitting upright in bed, her face pale and tear-streaked. She said there was a man in her room. I checked every corner, under the bed, inside her closet. Nothing. She kept insisting he was standing by the window seat, staring at her. Rachel spent the rest of the night in her bed, comforting her. I sat awake in our room, staring at the dark ceiling, feeling powerless. I started noticing other things too. Cold spots in the hallway, a faint smell of cigarettes, even though none of us smoked. Sometimes when I passed the mirror at the end of the hall, I thought I saw movement behind me, only to turn around and find nothing there. One time, while working late in the living room, I heard whispering coming from the kitchen. I thought it was Rachel, but when I went in, the room was empty and she was fast asleep upstairs. I didn't mention it to her because I didn't want to scare her more than she already was. The attic, though, became a source of fixation for me. That nagging feeling that something was wrong with it wouldn't go away. One Saturday, I finally pulled the ladder down and climbed up. The air was thick with dust, and beams of sunlight from a small window cut across the space. At first, it looked like any other attic, boxes, old furniture left behind, and cobwebs in the corners. But as I looked closer, I realized some of the boxes weren't that old. They didn't belong to us, and they didn't look like they'd been up there for decades. Inside one, I found children's toys, wooden blocks, a small tin car, and a faded stuffed bear. Another box had men's clothing, neatly folded but yellowed with age. Then I found a shoe, small, like it belonged to a child, but with a dark reddish-brown stain across the leather. My heart sank, and I quickly shoved the boxes back into place, trying to convince myself it wasn't as sinister as it looked. Things escalated after that. Lily grew more withdrawn. She stopped sitting in her window seat and refused to sleep alone. She would say things like, "He doesn't like it when I close my door," or "He told me not to tell you what he looks like." Rachel started to break down, too. She hated being in the house during the day alone, claiming she constantly felt watched. One afternoon, I came home from work and found her standing in the middle of the kitchen, visibly shaken. She said she'd been cleaning when she heard someone humming a tune right behind her ear. When she spun around, no one was there. I tried to be rational, but The more I tried to explain things away, the less convincing I sounded, even to myself. And then came the night that still makes my stomach twist whenever I think about it. It was around 2 in the morning when I woke up again. But this time, it wasn't because of a noise. It was because I felt the bed dip, like someone had sat down on it. My immediate thought was that Lily had come into our room. I reached out in the dark, but my hand touched nothing. Rachel stirred and asked what was wrong. Uh, and I whispered that I thought Lily had climbed into our bed. But when I looked toward the foot of the bed, my eyes adjusting to the dark, I saw a figure. A man sitting there, his back to us, shoulders hunched. I couldn't make out his face, just the outline. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone. Rachel asked what I was staring at, and I told her nothing, though my heart was pounding so hard I thought she could hear it. The next morning, Lily asked me why I was sitting on her bed last night. I told her I hadn't been, and she looked confused. "But you were," she said. "You told me you wanted me to keep the window open." She wouldn't say anything else after that, no matter how much I pressed her. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. We were eating dinner when there was a loud crash upstairs, like something heavy had fallen. I ran up, but when I opened Lily's door, my stomach dropped. Every single one of her toys was arranged in a perfect circle in the middle of the floor. She swore she hadn't touched them. That night, we packed a few bags and stayed at a hotel. We ended up moving out within a month. Rachel couldn't handle it anymore, and neither could I. We never fully unpacked again in that house. I didn't even bother selling it. We left it to the bank. Sometimes I still wonder what was really happening there. I try to tell myself it was stress or our imaginations, but late at night, when the house we live in now creaks, I can't help but remember the figure at the foot of our bed, or Lily whispering about the man who told her to keep the window open. Story, the end. The house wasn't supposed to feel the way it did. On paper, it was everything we had been looking for. A 3-bedroom colonial, tucked into a quiet suburban neighborhood in Pennsylvania, with a big fenced backyard, hardwood floors, and a finished basement. After years of saving, after renting cramped apartments and listening to neighbors stomp around above us, my wife, Erin, and I finally signed the papers and moved in. It was a huge moment, something we had dreamed about for years. We had plans, repainting the walls, filling the extra bedroom with a nursery someday, building a deck out back. At first, it was the little quirks of an older house. Creaks in the floorboards, doors that didn't quite shut all the way, windows that rattled if the wind picked up. The home inspection hadn't revealed anything major, so we chalked it up to the house's age. Still, there was something about the silence that didn't sit right with me. Even when the television was on or when I was listening to music while unpacking boxes, I'd catch myself noticing how the sound seemed to vanish in certain corners, like the walls were swallowing it. The first odd thing happened the second night we were there. Erin had gone to bed early, exhausted from unpacking. I was in the living room, breaking down cardboard boxes and stacking them to take to recycling. I heard footsteps upstairs, not Erin moving around in the bedroom. These were lighter, quicker, like someone pacing. I froze, listening. The sound stopped as soon as I noticed it. I climbed the stairs slowly, checking each room. Erin was asleep, breathing evenly. The hallway was empty, the guest rooms still stacked with boxes. I told myself it was the house settling, maybe pipes, maybe the wood shifting. But deep down, I didn't believe it. The basement was another story. From the start, I didn't like going down there. It had been finished by the previous owners, carpeted with beige walls, recessed lighting, and even a mounted TV stand left behind. On the surface, it should have been perfect, ideal for a home theater or game room. But the air down there always felt different, heavier somehow. Even when the heat was on, it was colder than the rest of the house. My footsteps sounded muffled, like the carpet was swallowing more than sound. Erin laughed when I mentioned it, teasing me about being superstitious. About a week in, she admitted she had her own moment. She had been home alone during the day, working on unpacking the kitchen. She told me later she heard someone say her name in a low voice from the direction of the back hallway. She had spun around, thinking maybe I had come home from work early, but no one was there. The dog we had just adopted, a rescue named Cooper, was staring down the hall with his ears back and teeth bared. That was when Erin's laughter about me being superstitious stopped. We started sleeping with lights on in the hall. At first, it was just for comfort, but then it became necessity. Every night without fail, something would wake us up. Sometimes it was knocking, 3 knocks, always 3 against the bedroom wall. Sometimes it was footsteps in the hallway. Once, I woke to the sound of the closet door creaking open. I reached for the lamp, but the bulb flickered and went out before I could turn it on. When I looked at the closet, the door was wide open. Cooper refused to go into the basement at all. He would stand at the top of the stairs, hackles raised, growling. If we tried to coax him down, he'd whine and back away. One night, when I went down there to check the fuse box after a breaker tripped, I felt this sharp cold draft sweep past me on the stairs. I almost dropped the flashlight. I tried telling myself it was air circulation, but there were no open vents near the stairwell. 2 weeks into living there, Erin found something strange when she was cleaning out one of the closets in the basement. Behind a loose panel of drywall tucked between the studs was a small wooden box. Inside were 3 things: a rusted key, a faded Polaroid picture of the house that looked like it was taken decades ago, and a slip of yellowed paper with handwriting so smudged it was nearly illegible. The only word we could make out clearly was "stay." Erin laughed nervously and said maybe it was some weird time capsule the previous owners left behind. But I could tell by her face she didn't believe that either. That night, the knocking came again. 3 times, harder than usual, so loud it shook a frame on the wall. Cooper started barking, frantic, staring at the same wall where we'd found the hidden box. Erin clutched my arm, whispering for me not to get up, but I couldn't just lie there. I pressed my ear against the wall, half expecting to hear pipes rattling or some animal scratching. Instead, it was silent, too silent. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then, clear as day, there was a voice on the other side of the wall. It whispered my name. The next day, I called the realtor. I didn't say anything about ghosts or voices, just asked about the house's history. She hesitated. That pause told me everything. Finally, she admitted the house had been on the market for years, bought and sold several times, with people never staying long. Some families had broken their leases early, others sold quickly, losing money just to get out. She didn't say why, just that people found it unsettling. That word stuck with me. Unsettling. It didn't cover the way I felt walking into the basement after dark. It didn't cover the shadow Erin swore she saw in the kitchen one night, standing just behind her reflection in the window. The scariest moment happened about a month in. Erin and I were lying in bed when we both heard heavy footsteps climbing the stairs. They weren't faint, weren't creaks. We both heard them, clear as if someone was walking up slowly. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed and rushed to the door, throwing it open. The hallway was empty, but I could still hear the steps, louder now, coming toward the bedroom. Erin was screaming for me to shut the door. The footsteps stopped right outside, but when I looked, no one was there, just empty air. After that night, things escalated, doors slamming shut in empty rooms, the lights flickering on and off, sometimes staying off even after we flipped the breaker. Erin woke up with scratches down her arm one morning, thin red lines like fingernails. She swore she hadn't done it in her sleep. Cooper grew more and more nervous, spending his nights hiding under the bed instead of at the foot of it. I tried to rationalize it. Even called an electrician to check the wiring, a pest control company to check for animals in the walls. Nothing explained the voices, the footsteps, or why the hidden box had been sealed away in the first place. Then came the night that drove us out. I woke to the sound of Erin choking. At first, I thought she was having a nightmare, but when I turned the lamp on, I saw her thrashing, clawing at her throat like invisible hands were wrapped around it. I grabbed her, shouting, and suddenly she was free, gasping for air. Her neck had red marks around it like someone had gripped her. That was the moment I decided we weren't staying another night. We packed what we could into the car before sunrise, leaving furniture, boxes, even clothes behind. Erin didn't argue. Neither of us cared about the money anymore. Weeks later, after moving in with her sister temporarily, I went back during the day to meet movers and collect the rest of our belongings. The house looked different in daylight, almost normal. I went to the basement one last time just to prove to myself it had all been in my head. The air was still cold. The carpet still muffled my steps, but as I turned to leave, I noticed the hidden panel again. Only this time, the wooden box was gone. We never figured out who or what was in that house. We never went back. The realtor put it up for sale again within a month. Last I checked, it was still listed, waiting for someone new to sign the papers to think they'd found their dream home. Story: the end. When we first bought the house, it felt like a victory. My wife, Emily, and I had been saving for years to get out of the cramped two-bedroom apartment we'd lived in since our wedding. We wanted space, something permanent, something that could hold our growing family. The house we ended up finding was an older colonial-style place in a small town in upstate New York, tucked back on a quiet street where the trees arched overhead and the yards stretched wide enough that you couldn't hear your neighbor sneezing through the wall anymore. It had 4 bedrooms, creaky wooden floors, and a basement that smelled faintly of damp stone. The price was lower than what other homes in the area went for, and although that should have given us pause, we told ourselves it was just because it was old. Old houses creak, they settle, and they need work. That was what we told ourselves. We moved in during the fall, just before the leaves finished turning. The house had character. That was the word Emily liked to use. She loved the big bay window in the living room and the way the staircase curved upward in this sweeping motion that reminded her of old movies. I'll admit I loved it too, at least at first. The charm, though, was mixed with little things you'd only notice after spending time there. Doors that didn't quite shut all the way, drafts that came from corners you couldn't quite seal, outlets that sparked if you plugged in the vacuum the wrong way. Still, it was ours, and that mattered more. The first night we slept there, the house felt alive. That was the only way I could describe it. Lying in bed, every sound seemed sharper. The settling groans of the wood, the rattle of the wind against old glass panes, the occasional creak from somewhere downstairs. Emily was asleep quickly, but I found myself staring into the dark, trying to convince myself it was normal. When I finally dozed off, I dreamed of footsteps moving slowly down the hall outside our bedroom. We brushed off the noises at first. That's what new homeowners do. The basement was particularly unsettling, though. I'd go down there to check the furnace, and every time I felt like I was intruding. The walls were rough stone, damp in patches, and the single hanging light bulb cast just enough shadow to make you think someone was standing in the far corner, waiting. The previous owners had left some old shelves, a rusted toolbox, and a pile of boards stacked against the far wall. On one of my first trips down there, I noticed faint scratch marks on the stone near the floor. They weren't deep, but they didn't look like anything caused by moving furniture. They looked deliberate, like claw marks. One evening, a few weeks after moving in, Emily called me into the kitchen. She was staring at the ceiling, pointing toward the attic. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I hadn't. She swore she heard something dragging across the floor above us. I shrugged it off, told her maybe it was a squirrel, but when I pulled down the rickety attic ladder and poked my head up with a flashlight, the space was empty. Just dust, insulation, and the faint outline of footprints in the dust that didn't belong to us. The house's quirks grew harder to explain away. At night, we'd hear doors click shut upstairs when we knew no windows were open. Sometimes we'd wake up to find the lights in the hallway on, even though we were sure we'd turned them off. One morning, Emily walked into the kitchen and stopped dead. Every chair from the table had been moved and lined up neatly against the wall. Neither of us had done it. I remember one night vividly because it was the first time the fear really settled into me. I had gone downstairs around 2 a.m. to grab a glass of water. The kitchen was quiet, moonlight spilling across the floor from the window above the sink. As I filled my glass, I noticed movement in the reflection of the glass cabinet doors. It looked like someone walked across the hallway behind me. My chest tightened and I spun around, but the hall was empty. The air, though, it felt heavier, charged, like someone had just been there. I barely slept after that. Emily started complaining of nightmares. She said she kept dreaming of someone standing over her, their face obscured, just staring. Sometimes she woke up gasping, swearing she felt fingers brushing her arm. I tried to comfort her, but secretly I had started waking in the middle of the night too, with the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone in the room. Things escalated when we finally decided to set up the nursery. Emily was pregnant and we were excited, but the house seemed to resist the change. We painted the walls, set up the crib, put together a little rocking chair. The night we finished, we left the door slightly ajar. The next morning, the door was wide open and the rocking chair was moving, slow and steady, as if someone had just stood up from it. I wanted to believe it was the draft. I wanted to. But then there was the night when I was heading upstairs and I heard humming. Soft, almost like a lullaby. It was coming from the nursery. My stomach dropped. Emily was already asleep in our room. I pushed the nursery door open slowly, my heart pounding so loud I thought it would wake her. The room was dark, the rocking chair still again, but the air carried that faint tune and it stopped the moment I stepped inside. We started avoiding the basement after that. Neither of us wanted to admit it, but we both felt worse down there as time went on. The scratches on the walls seemed more noticeable, like they were spreading. One night during a storm, the power went out and I had no choice but to head down to check the breaker. Halfway down the stairs, I froze. There was breathing. Not mine. Slow, ragged, coming from the far side of the room. I stood there, holding my phone up like a pathetic flashlight, telling myself it was in my head. But I swear I saw something shift in the shadows, something hunched low to the ground. I bolted back upstairs and told Emily the power would just come back on by itself. Neighbors didn't have much to say about the house. When I mentioned where we'd moved, I noticed people would pause a little too long before replying. One older man, Mr. Harris, who lived across the street, finally said something one morning when I was grabbing the paper. "That place has seen things," he muttered, not quite meeting my eye. I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and went back inside. Emily grew more distant. She was exhausted all the time, and it wasn't just the pregnancy. She said she felt watched constantly, even during the day. Sometimes I'd come home from work and find her sitting in the living room with all the lights on, curtains drawn, like she was trying to keep something out or in. The breaking point came a few months later, late at night. I woke up to the sound of crying, faint but distinct. For a second, I thought it was the baby, except Emily hadn't given birth yet. The sound was coming from the nursery. I nudged her awake, and we both sat up listening. The crying grew louder, then cut off abruptly, replaced by the sound of the rocking chair creaking back and forth. I'll never forget the look on Emily's face. She was pale, her eyes wide with sheer terror. We didn't go in that night. We just sat in our bed, holding each other, listening to the creaking until it finally stopped around dawn. The next day, we made a decision. We couldn't stay. I didn't care that we'd put everything into the house. I didn't care that it made no sense to leave when the baby was almost due. We packed what we could, called Emily's sister, and moved in with her until we figured things out. I went back to the house one last time by myself to grab the last boxes. The place felt emptier, but also heavier, like it knew we were leaving. As I carried the final box through the living room, I glanced toward the bay window. For just a second, I swear I saw someone standing there. A woman, pale, with hollow eyes, staring right at me. I blinked, and she was gone. We sold the house at a loss, never telling the new buyers what had happened. Maybe that makes us cruel, maybe desperate. All I know is that even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and swear I hear that faint lullaby drifting through the dark. Story. The end. Moving into the house felt like the start of a new chapter. I had been saving for years, scraping together enough money to finally put down roots in a place I could call my own. It wasn't fancy, but it was bigger than the one-bedroom apartments I had spent the last decade in. The house was a modest two-story in a quiet American suburb, built sometime in the late 1960s. It had charm in the kind of way that felt a little dated but welcoming, the sort of house with creaky hardwood floors, narrow staircases, and a yard that needed more attention than I had time to give. When I first stepped inside with the realtor, everything had smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, as if someone had just mopped. The sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains in the living room, giving everything a soft glow. The realtor kept telling me how lucky I was to snag the place at the price I did, considering the market. She never said why the owners had left so quickly, and I didn't ask. I was too blinded by the excitement of finally owning a home. The first few days after moving in were uneventful. Most of my time was spent unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and making lists of all the things that still needed to be done. New paint for the upstairs hallway, new locks for the doors, eventually some work in the basement. The basement was unfinished, just a wide, low-ceilinged space with exposed pipes and a single dangling bulb. I didn't plan on spending much time down there, but it was good for storage. I noticed the first odd thing my second night in the house. I had gone to bed around 11, exhausted from carrying heavy boxes all day. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a faint creaking sound. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, old wood expanding and contracting, but the sound continued steadily, like slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the floor above me. The problem was, I was on the top floor. I sat up in bed, heart thudding in my chest. The house was supposed to be empty except for me. I grabbed the flashlight I kept on my nightstand and stepped into the hallway. Everything was still. The floorboards didn't make a sound under my feet as I crept to the attic door, which was at the far end of the hall. The previous owner had left one of those pull-down ladders installed, and I had barely glanced at it during my walkthrough. I stood there for what felt like a long time, shining the beam of the flashlight up at the hatch. Nothing moved. Eventually, I convinced myself that I had been imagining things and went back to bed. But I slept with the flashlight in my hand and didn't fully close my eyes until the first light of dawn crept into the room. Over the next week, little things began to pile up. A box I had left sealed in the living room was open one morning, its contents scattered across the floor. The bathroom door, which I was certain I had shut before bed, would sometimes be wide open in the morning. Once I came home from work to find the radio playing softly in the kitchen, even though I didn't remember plugging it in yet. I told myself I was just stressed. Moving into a new place, living alone for the first time in years, it was bound to play tricks on my mind. But then came the night I heard someone whisper my name. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard it. Faint, low, almost like a breath carried through the air. Evan. I froze, staring at the darkened doorway. My phone screen dimmed, casting the room into shadows. I held my breath, listening. The whisper came again, softer this time, as though it was right beside my ear. I leapt out of bed, turning on every light in the upstairs hallway. I searched the closets, the bathroom, even opened the attic hatch and poked my head inside. The attic was empty, just dust and insulation and a couple of old boxes left behind. Still, I barely slept that night. After that, the atmosphere of the house began to shift. It was subtle at first, a constant chill in the upstairs hallway, the way certain rooms felt heavy, as though the air was thick. The basement, in particular, became a place I avoided. Anytime I went down there to grab something, I felt like I was being watched. The bulb always flickered when I pulled the chain, and shadows seemed to stretch just a little too far. One evening, I invited my friend Mark over. I didn't tell him what had been happening. I just wanted another person in the house. We drank a couple of beers, watched a game in the living room, and talked about work. Everything felt normal until he excused himself to use the bathroom upstairs. When he came back down, he looked unsettled. "What?" I asked him. He shook his head. "I swear, man, when I was washing my hands, I thought I saw someone in the mirror behind me. Just for a second. Some guy standing in the hallway, but when I turned around, there was nothing." I tried to laugh it off, but the unease in his voice matched the dread I'd been feeling for days. Later that night, after Mark left, I walked upstairs and stopped in front of the bathroom mirror. I stood there staring at my reflection, the hallway behind me visible in the glass. I waited, half hoping, half dreading that something would appear. Nothing did. But as I turned to leave, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, just a quick flicker of something pale slipping into the bedroom at the end of the hall. I stood frozen, my pulse hammering. That was the guest bedroom. I hadn't even put furniture in there yet. I forced myself to walk down the hall. The door was cracked open. I pushed it slowly, the hinges groaning, and shone my flashlight inside. The room was empty, just bare walls and a cold draft that lifted the hair on my arms. I started keeping the door shut after that. The worst night came a couple of weeks later. A storm rolled through town and the power went out just after midnight. I lit a few candles and tried to go back to sleep, but the wind and rain battered the house, keeping me awake. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again. Those slow, deliberate footsteps. This time, they were coming up the stairs. I sat up in bed, clutching the flashlight, though I wasn't sure I wanted to use it. The sound was unmistakable. One step, then another, the weight of something pressing down on the old wood. My bedroom door was half open, and I could see the shadows shifting in the hallway as though someone was moving just beyond sight. "Who's there?" My voice cracked, sounding far weaker than I intended. No answer. Just the creak of another step, closer now. The doorknob began to turn, slowly, as though someone on the other side was testing it. I lunged forward and slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might drown out the sound of the storm. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then, softly, the whisper came again, right against the door. "Evan." I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back against the door until dawn, flashlight clutched so tightly my fingers ached. When the sun finally rose, the house was silent, as if nothing had happened. I called the realtor later that day and asked if anything unusual had ever occurred in the house. She hesitated before answering, then admitted that the previous owner had moved out suddenly after his brother, who had been living with him, passed away in the house. She didn't know the details, just that he died upstairs. I don't know if I believe in ghosts. I've tried to rationalize everything, the noises, the whispers, the shadows, as stress or the quirks of an old house. But every night, as I lie in bed, I hear the faint creaking in the hallway, the slow footsteps moving closer, and I know it's only a matter of time before the door opens. Story, the end. When my wife and I bought the house, it felt like a fresh start. We had been renting cramped apartments for years, each one a little more run down than the last, and when we finally managed to save up enough for a down payment, we jumped at the chance to own a place of our own. The house wasn't new, but it was bigger than anything we'd lived in before. A 2-story with a front porch and a yard that backed onto a stretch of woods. It was quiet, the kind of suburban quiet we'd wanted for so long. The first time we walked through it with the realtor, there was something about the way the place smelled. Old wood, faintly damp, but not unpleasant, that made me picture fall afternoons, leaves crunching underfoot, kids playing in the yard. My wife, Laura, loved the wide staircase and the way the morning light spilled into the kitchen. We overlooked the creaks in the floorboards and the occasional draft from the windows. After years of scraping by, imperfections felt manageable. We moved in on a warm May weekend. By the second night, boxes were stacked in the living room, and we were eating pizza on the kitchen floor. Everything was chaotic but exciting. At one point, I got up to grab some water and noticed the back door, the one that led out onto the deck, was unlocked. I knew I'd locked it earlier. Laura said I'd probably just forgotten. I didn't argue. I was too tired to think much about it. Over the next few weeks, the strangeness crept in slowly. It was little things, the kind of stuff you could brush off as your imagination. One morning, I came downstairs before work and found the refrigerator door open. Nothing had fallen out, nothing looked disturbed, but it had been wide open for who knows how long. We laughed it off. "Maybe the house ghosts are hungry," Laura said. But later that same week, the stove burner clicked on by itself while she was in the kitchen. She turned it off, unsettled, but when I tested it later, everything seemed fine. The house was draftier than we realized, too. Doors would swing shut on their own, especially upstairs. One night, around 2 in the morning, we both woke up to the sound of the bathroom door slamming. I got up, annoyed, and checked the windows. They were closed. I even tested the hallway floor to see if a draft was coming up from below. Nothing. The air was still. We told ourselves it was just settling, the quirks of an older house. Still, I noticed Laura stopped leaving the bedroom door open at night. The first time I saw something, it was so quick I almost convinced myself it hadn't happened. I was heading downstairs late, maybe close to midnight, because I couldn't sleep. I thought I saw someone at the bottom of the staircase. Just a shape, like a figure stepping into the kitchen. My first thought was that someone had broken in. I froze halfway down, heart pounding, and then flipped the hallway light on. Nothing. The kitchen was empty, silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I searched the whole downstairs, even opened the basement door and peeked inside, but there was nothing out of place. I didn't tell Laura that night. She had her own encounter a few days later. I came home from work to find her sitting at the kitchen table, pale and shaken. She said she'd been upstairs unpacking books when she heard someone whisper her name, not from outside the window, but from inside the room. She turned around, expecting me to be standing there, but the room was empty. She swore it had been clear as day, right in her ear. Laura. After that, the house started feeling heavier somehow, like the air itself had weight. Even in the middle of the day, it felt darker than it should. I suggested maybe we just weren't used to the space yet. Houses make noises, shadows play tricks. But Laura wasn't convinced. She'd always been more intuitive than me, more sensitive to atmospheres. She started sleeping with the lamp on. One evening, while unpacking boxes in the basement, I found something that unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Against the far wall, behind some shelves, there was a small wooden door, like a crawl space. It wasn't on the house's floor plan. When I pulled the shelves aside, I realized it had been painted the same color as the wall, like someone had tried to hide it. The latch was rusty, but with some effort, I pried it open. The space beyond was narrow and low, like a hidden storage area. Inside, I found a stack of old newspapers, yellowed and brittle, dating back to the late 70s, and tucked between them, a small box filled with Polaroid photos. The photos were of the house. Some showed the kitchen, the living room, the staircase. But what disturbed me were the ones of people. Families, sitting stiffly on the couch, kids smiling awkwardly, a man standing in the doorway. I didn't recognize anyone. They weren't the people we'd bought the house from. And in almost every photo, there was something odd. Someone's face blurred, an extra hand on a shoulder, a figure in the background that didn't belong. I didn't tell Laura about the crawl space or the photos right away. I shoved the box back inside and moved the shelves to cover the door again. That night, though, I dreamt of someone standing at the foot of our bed. When I woke up, the room was dark, but I swear I could hear breathing that wasn't ours. Things escalated after that. Footsteps in the hallway at night became common. Sometimes we'd hear them when we were both in bed, unmistakable creaks moving slowly past the door. Once, Laura thought she heard someone running up the stairs, but when I got up to check, the house was silent. Then objects started moving. Keys we'd left on the counter would be on the floor. A chair in the dining room shifted just enough that you could tell it wasn't where you'd left it. One afternoon, Laura found all the kitchen cabinets wide open, though she'd been alone in the house. The worst was the night we heard crying. We both woke up at the same time. It was faint at first, like it was coming from far away, but it grew louder, a child's sobs echoing through the house. We sat frozen in bed, listening. It seemed to move, first from the hallway, then downstairs. When I finally got up the nerve to check, flashlight in hand, the sound stopped the second I stepped into the hall. I called my dad the next day, half embarrassed, half desperate for some kind of logical explanation. He laughed it off, told me we'd probably just spooked ourselves in the big new place. Old houses settle, he said. They make noises. I wanted to believe him. But Laura was unraveling. She started refusing to be alone in the house. She'd wait outside for me to get home from work. She talked about selling, even though we'd barely been there 3 months. One night, after another argument about leaving, I finally told her about the crawl space and the photos. She was furious I'd kept it from her. But when I showed her, her anger turned to fear. She went through the Polaroids one by one, her hands shaking. At the bottom of the stack, she froze. The last photo was of our bedroom. The same bed, the same layout. And in the photo, a woman stood at the side of the bed, her face blurred, her hand resting on the blankets. We didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Laura packed a bag and went to stay with her sister. I stayed behind, too stubborn to let whatever was in that house drive me out. But being alone made everything worse. The noises grew constant, footsteps, whispers, the sound of doors opening and closing. I started keeping all the lights on at night. One evening, I came into the living room and found every photo frame we'd hung on the wall tilted at the exact same angle. Another time, I woke up to find the crawl space door open, though I'd locked it. I was in the basement again when I heard it for the first time. My name. Not whispered like Laura's had been, but spoken in a low, rasping voice. David. My legs nearly gave out. I spun around, shining my flashlight across the concrete walls. Nothing. The shelves stood where I'd left them, covering the crawlspace door. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that blurred woman from the Polaroid leaning over me. Laura begged me to leave, to stay with her at her sister's, but I was determined to figure it out, to prove it was something explainable. I started researching the house's history. At the county records office, I found that it had been built in 1974 and had changed hands several times. What caught my attention was that almost every family had moved out within a year. No reason listed, no foreclosure, just sudden sales. When I dug deeper, I found a newspaper clipping from 1981. A family of 4 had lived in the house, a husband, wife, and 2 kids. One night, the mother was found dead in the upstairs bathroom. The article called it a tragic accident, said she had slipped and hit her head. But the details were vague and there was no follow-up. The family moved away shortly after. That night, I dreamt of water running. I woke up to the sound of the bathroom faucet turned on full blast. When I went to shut it off, the mirror above the sink was fogged as if from steam, though the water had been cold. Written across the glass in uneven letters was one word: stay. I didn't tell Laura about that part, but I knew then we couldn't stay. Something was in that house, something that didn't want us there, but also didn't want us to leave. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head: stress, lack of sleep. Yet the evidence was there, piling up around me. The night before we left for good, I was sitting in the living room, too wired to sleep, when I saw her. The woman from the Polaroid. She stepped out of the hallway into the glow of the lamp, her face still blurred, her figure indistinct but unmistakably human. She stood there watching me, and then she lifted her arm and pointed at the stairs. I don't remember deciding to move, but I found myself climbing the staircase, each step heavy, dread pooling in my stomach. At the top, the bathroom door was open, the light on. I stepped inside and the door slammed shut behind me. The next thing I remember is Laura shaking me awake on the bathroom floor the next morning. She'd come back to get me because I hadn't answered my phone. My head hurt like I'd been knocked out. The faucet was running and the mirror was fogged again, but this time there were no words, just streaks, like someone had dragged their fingers down the glass. We left that day, packed what we could, and walked away. The house still sits there, I'm sure, waiting for the next family. I don't know what it wants or why it lingers, but I know what I saw, what we heard, what it did to us. And I know one thing for certain: if you ever find a house with a hidden door in the basement, don't open it. Story the end. When my wife and I signed the closing papers on the house, it felt like we were stepping into the next chapter of our lives. We had scrimped and saved for years, working extra hours, skipping vacations, and cutting corners wherever we could just so we could buy a place of our own. It wasn't a perfect house. It was old with creaky floors and outdated fixtures, but it had charm. It had a wraparound porch, big bay windows, and enough space for the family we were planning to start. It sat at the end of a quiet street in a little American town where everybody seemed to know each other's name. To us, it was everything we had dreamed about. The first couple of days were nothing but excitement. Moving boxes piled high, pizza boxes stacked on the counter, our laughter echoing through the empty hallways as we tried to figure out what went where. The neighbors were friendly enough, offering quick hellos, and one older lady from across the street even brought us a pie. She seemed nice, though she stared at the house longer than I felt comfortable with before she handed it over. When I thanked her, she nodded quickly and left without much small talk. At the time, I brushed it off as small-town awkwardness. Later, I realized it was something else entirely. Our first night in the house, we set up an air mattress in the living room since we hadn't assembled the bed yet. It was quiet, almost too quiet. We were used to the hum of city life, but here it was still enough that you could hear your own breathing. I remember lying there, staring at the ceiling, when I thought I heard footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate steps. I froze, holding my breath, listening. My wife was already half asleep, her breathing steady beside me. I almost woke her, but then I reasoned with myself. It was an old house. Houses settle. Wood creaks, pipes groan. That's all it was. But deep down, something about the rhythm of those steps didn't feel like the house shifting. It felt like someone moving. The next morning, I went upstairs to check everything. The doors were all still locked, nothing looked out of place, and no windows were open. I told myself it was just nerves and lack of sleep. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had crawled under my skin. Over the next week, little things started happening. Boxes we had stacked neatly in the hall closet were knocked over. A picture frame we hadn't hung yet shattered on the floor when no one was around. We blamed it on clumsiness, maybe the house being drafty, or even the cat we had just adopted, though I never once saw her go near that closet. She seemed skittish in the new house, always staring into corners, her tail puffing up for no reason. Cats are sensitive, people say. I told myself she was just adjusting. Then came the voices. At first I thought they were coming from outside. A man's low murmur, then a woman's reply, faint as if through a wall. I'd go out on the porch to see if neighbors were walking by, but the street would be empty. The air still. When I asked my wife about it, she admitted she'd heard it too, but we laughed it off nervously. Maybe sound carried strangely here. Thin walls, acoustics, whatever. We didn't want to acknowledge what we both suspected, that the voices were inside the house. A few nights later, I woke up to the feeling of the mattress shifting. It was subtle, like someone had sat down on the edge. My wife was asleep beside me, but when I turned my head toward the edge of the bed, there was nothing there. I sat up, heart hammering, scanning the dark room. My eyes adjusted slowly, and that's when I saw it. The closet door was open. I knew for a fact I had closed it before bed. The shadows inside seemed darker than the rest of the room, thick like they had weight. I couldn't move for a long time. Finally, I got up, walked over, and shut the door firmly. The handle felt cold, almost damp in my hand. I crawled back into bed and didn't sleep again until the sun came up. We started noticing patterns. The closet doors never stayed closed, no matter how many times we shut them. The kitchen cabinets would be standing open in the morning. The basement door, which we rarely used, was always unlocked, even after we had locked it. At first, we joked about having a friendly ghost, but the longer we lived there, the less funny it became. The atmosphere in the house grew heavier, more oppressive. The rooms always seemed colder than they should be, and there were moments when I'd be alone in the kitchen or bathroom and feel a hand brush against my back, though no one was there. One evening, I came home from work to find my wife sitting pale-faced on the couch. She told me she had been upstairs unpacking clothes when she heard someone whisper her name. Clear as day. She turned, expecting to see me, but the room was empty. When she went downstairs, she swore she saw a figure at the top of the steps, watching her. It was gone when she blinked. That night, she begged me not to leave her alone in the house again. I started digging into the history of the property. I went to the county records office and asked around town. Most people seemed uncomfortable when I mentioned our address, quick to change the subject. Finally, the woman at the records desk gave me a look like she didn't want to tell me, but couldn't lie either. She said the house had been vacant for years before we bought it, but before that, a family had lived there. A husband, wife, and their teenage daughter. She didn't give details, but she lowered her voice when she said, "They didn't move out. They died in there." I pressed her for more, but she shook her head and told me to let it go. That was the last thing she said before walking away. I didn't tell my wife at first. I didn't want to scare her more than she already was. But the activity only escalated. One night, we both woke to the sound of sobbing downstairs. It was faint, muffled, but undeniably human. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the bed and went down, every light on, checking each room. Nothing. But as I passed the dining room, I caught a glimpse of someone sitting at the table. Just for a second. A dark silhouette, head bent low like they were crying into their hands. Then it was gone. I stood there shaking, gripping the bat so hard my knuckles hurt. We started sleeping with the lights on, every lamp blazing. The cat had stopped coming out of the bedroom altogether. She hissed at the doorway whenever we tried to carry her out. My wife grew quieter, withdrawn, like the house was draining her. She said she felt like she was being watched constantly, and I couldn't argue. I felt it too. That prickling on the back of your neck, the sense of eyes boring into you from the shadows. It was there all the time now, from the moment we woke up to the moment we went to bed. One night, the worst happened. I woke to the sound of the closet door creaking open again. My wife stirred beside me. The room was freezing, our breath visible in the air. Slowly, I turned my head toward the closet. This time, there was something there. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing in the doorway. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and though the shadows hid most of its features, I could see its eyes. Empty, black hollows staring straight at us. My wife screamed, clutching my arm, and in that instant the figure lunged forward. The closet door slammed shut so hard the walls shook, and the lamp on the nightstand shattered. We bolted from the bed, ran down the stairs barefoot, and out the front door into the cold night air. We didn't go back inside until the sun rose. Even then, the house felt wrong. Silent, but not empty. We lasted another week before we broke. We packed only what we could fit in our car and left. The rest of our things are still in that house, sitting in boxes, gathering dust. We couldn't bring ourselves to go back for them. People still live on that street, still mow their lawns and wave to each other, but our house sits quiet. The curtains drawn, the porch sagging, a for sale sign leaning in the yard. Sometimes, when I drive past it, I swear I see someone standing at the upstairs window, staring out, always watching, always waiting. Story the end. When I first saw the house, I thought it was perfect. A recently built 2-story in a quiet American suburb, freshly painted with wide windows and a fenced backyard. My husband Mark and I had been renting tiny apartments for years, and the chance to own a house of our own felt like a dream come true. The realtor told us it had been on the market for months, but there were no price reductions. Maybe the previous owners had simply lost interest. We didn't care. We just wanted it. The first few days were magical. We spent hours unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, imagining parties and holidays. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet, but we convinced ourselves it was just the charm of a suburban street. It started subtly. The night we moved in, I woke to a cold draft brushing against my arm. I thought one of the windows had been left open, but they were all shut. Mark was already asleep, deep under the blankets, oblivious. I told myself it was nothing. The first oddity came from the upstairs hallway. We had left our bedroom door open that first night, and when I went to check the bathroom, I noticed the door at the far end of the hall, the guest bedroom, was slightly ajar. I could have sworn I had closed it. Inside, the room was empty. A chair sat in the corner, facing the wall. I shrugged and closed the door. Over the next week, small things began to accumulate. Footsteps on the hardwood when we were alone. A chair in the kitchen that seemed to have moved overnight. Light switches flipped on and off with no one near them. At first, we laughed it off, blaming drafts or our imagination. Then, the voices started. At first, it was just whispers, faint and unintelligible. I would hear them while folding laundry in the living room or washing dishes in the kitchen. Sometimes they seemed to call my name. Sarah, Sarah. I would freeze, my heart racing, and the sounds would stop when I looked around. Mark tried to comfort me. "It's just a new house settling," he'd say. But I noticed he was staying later at work, avoiding being alone at home, just like I was. One evening, while I was unpacking boxes in the basement, I discovered a small trapdoor behind a stack of unused shelving. It had been painted the same color as the wall, nearly invisible. The latch was rusted, but with some effort, I pried it open. Inside was a narrow crawl space filled with old belongings. Boxes, old furniture, and a stack of photographs. I brought a few up to show Mark. The photographs were of people, families that had lived in the house long before us. Most were ordinary, but in almost every picture there was something off. A shadowy figure in the background, a face blurred or hidden, a hand resting somewhere it shouldn't be. In one photo, a woman stood at the side of a bed, blurred and indistinct, but her presence was undeniable. We became hyper-aware of the house after that. The footsteps grew more distinct, now echoing from the attic or the corners of rooms we hadn't noticed before. Doors slammed shut on their own. Once I woke to see the front door wide open, though it had been locked securely. One night around 2 a.m, Mark woke me, panicked. He said he had seen someone standing at the foot of our bed. A figure, tall and thin, shadowed, faceless, just standing there, watching. By the time I turned on the lamp, it was gone. We didn't sleep that night. The house seemed alive, breathing, waiting. In the following days, the crawlspace became a point of terror. Objects from inside would appear elsewhere in the house. A box that had been in the corner of the crawlspace would be on the kitchen table. A photograph would appear framed on the wall, even though we hadn't touched it. One evening, while hanging a picture, I noticed a reflection in the glass. Not ours, but someone else's. The house's history only made things worse. I found old newspaper clippings about previous occupants, families leaving suddenly, a woman found dead in the bathtub, accidents that didn't quite add up. Many had abandoned the house in fear, though none explained what they had seen. The final straw came one rainy night. The storm rattled the windows and the electricity flickered constantly. In the living room, the shadows seemed to move independently of the furniture. Whispering voices surrounded us, calling our names in unison. I ran upstairs to the bedroom, and Mark followed. That's when we saw her, the woman from the photographs. She was standing at the top of the stairs, her face blurred, her form slightly transparent, but real. She pointed at the bedroom door, and the whispering voices coalesced into one chilling command: leave. We didn't argue. We packed what we could, leaving most of our belongings behind, and fled in the middle of the storm. The house stood silently behind us, the rain washing its facade, but somehow it felt alive, watching us go. Years later, I still drive past that street. The house is still there, pristine, quiet, empty. Or at least, it looks empty. Sometimes I swear I see shadows behind the windows, silhouettes that move just slightly too deliberately. I've told friends never to go near it, but the house waits patiently, like it always has, for the next family to walk through the front door. Some houses are just houses. Some are traps. Some are alive. We learned that the hard way. Story the end. We had been searching for months before we found the house. My wife, Clara, and I were desperate to leave the city and start fresh. Work had drained us, the apartment felt smaller every month, and the neighbors were more interested in gossip than friendship. When we drove up the long, winding driveway that led to the house, I felt a flicker of hope. The house was old, a two-story colonial with faded white paint and a sagging porch, surrounded by thick trees that cast long shadows even in the midday sun. The real estate agent had called it quaint and full of character. We called it home. The first night, we unpacked just enough to make the bedroom livable. The rest of the boxes stayed in the living room, stacked high like a temporary barrier between the unknown and us. The house was quiet, or so we thought. As we lay in bed, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and groans, I could swear I heard a whisper. "Hello?" I whispered back, half laughing, half nervous. Clara rolled over, eyes heavy with sleep, and muttered something about the wind. I tried to convince myself of the same, but the feeling didn't leave me. A subtle pressure in the room, like invisible eyes tracking my every movement. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. Small at first, doors we had locked would be open when we returned, boxes moved slightly from where we had placed them, and the air sometimes seemed to grow inexplicably cold. One morning, I found a set of muddy footprints in the hallway, leading from the living room to the stairs, though we had cleaned the floors thoroughly the night before. Clara said it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon that had gotten in, but the doors were all locked, and the windows closed. Then came the sounds. Faint whispers, footsteps pacing above us late at night, the creak of doors opening slowly, then slamming shut. At first, we tried to dismiss them, but they grew louder, more persistent. Clara told me she woke one night to someone humming in the kitchen. She had gone downstairs, thinking it was me, only to find the room empty, the lights off, and a lingering smell of something metallic, like blood. That smell haunted us for days. I began exploring the house more during the day, trying to rationalize what was happening. The basement was unfinished, dark and musty, but otherwise normal. The attic, however, gave me pause. The air was thick, suffocating, and the old wood seemed to groan under its own weight. There were old photographs stacked in a corner, black and white pictures of a family, smiling stiffly for the camera. Something about the eyes in the photographs unsettled me, though I couldn't explain why. One night, everything escalated. We were in the bedroom when the lights flickered and went out entirely. In the darkness, I felt it immediately. A presence in the room, close, watching. Clara whispered my name, her voice trembling. Then came the whispers, circling around us, coming from every corner at once. One distinct voice, deeper than the rest, said clearly, "Get out." The temperature plummeted. Our breath formed clouds in front of us. Then a shadow detached itself from the far corner, tall, hunched, and impossibly dark. Its head tilted unnaturally, and the shape of its hands seemed wrong, long, skeletal, almost claw-like. We ran, stumbling down the stairs in the dark. The front door refused to open at first, as if the house itself was holding us in. When it finally gave way, we didn't stop until we reached our car. Clara was shaking, sobbing, and I could feel my own pulse in my throat. We drove without headlights for the first few blocks, too scared to look back, and didn't stop until we were at a friend's house, well outside town. We never returned to the house. The real estate agent eventually sold it to another family, but I still think about the shadows, the whispers, the cold presence that lingered long after we left. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can see the dark figure at the top of the stairs, head tilted, watching, waiting. I know it's still there, in that house, for the next people who move in. I don't know what it wants, but I do know it's patient, and it never forgets. Story the end. I remember the day we first walked into the house like it was yesterday. It was late afternoon, the sun hanging low and casting long shadows over the quiet street. My wife, Emily, had dragged me along for what she called the perfect new start. The house itself was older, a Victorian with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch, but it had charm. Enough charm, at least, to make the price seem reasonable. The moment we stepped inside, the air felt wrong, heavy, stale, like the house had been holding its breath for years. Emily didn't notice. She was already running her hands over the woodwork, envisioning curtains and furniture. I tried to shake off the unease as we explored the rooms. The floors groaned under our weight, and the house smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic I couldn't identify. We moved in a week later. The first few days were typical. Boxes everywhere, kids, our daughter Lily and son Ben, running up and down the stairs. But at night, I began hearing things. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing the hallway outside our bedroom. I would wake Emily, and she would insist it was just the house settling. The noises grew. Doors that we had locked would be open in the morning. Sometimes I would find chairs pulled away from tables, books misplaced, drawers slightly open. The kids started complaining. Lily said she saw a man standing in the corner of her room at night, tall and pale with dark, hollow eyes. Ben spoke of whispers calling his name. I tried to rationalize it. Stress from the move, dreams, children's imagination. But began noticing things I couldn't explain. Scratches along the walls that weren't there before. Cold spots that moved as I walked through the house. Fleeting shadows that disappeared when I turned toward them. One night, about 2 months after we moved in, I woke to a sound I will never forget. Heavy breathing. Directly beside the bed. I froze, heart pounding. Emily was asleep, unaware. I whispered for her to wake up. She rolled over, confused, and then she heard it too. The breathing stopped the moment we switched on the lamp. After that night, we couldn't ignore it. Emily began sleeping in the living room with the kids. I stayed in the bedroom, but I could feel it watching me. The presence in the house wasn't subtle anymore. Shadows moved with intent, objects levitated slightly before dropping. The whispers became voices muttering words we couldn't fully understand. Then came the night we saw him. It was during a storm. Rain pounded against the roof, wind rattled the windows, and we were trying to calm the kids who were sobbing in fear. I looked toward the hallway and saw a figure, tall, hunched, pale, standing just at the threshold of Lily's room. Its eyes were black, hollow, and fixed on us. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel the hatred emanating from it. I tried to approach, but my legs felt like lead. Emily grabbed my arm, dragging me back as the figure slowly faded into the shadows. The door slammed behind it. The lights flickered and then went out. We packed and left that night. Took only what we could carry. I've never returned. Sometimes when the wind is strong and the night is quiet, I swear I can still hear whispers and footsteps. And I wonder if the house waits patient for the next family to come along, to fall into its grip the way we did. Some houses aren't homes. Some houses are traps. Story the end. I still remember the first time I walked into that house. My name's Rachel, and I had just moved to a small town in rural Ohio for work. I'd been living in cramped apartments my whole life, and when I found the listing for this old Victorian on the edge of town, I felt like I'd stumbled onto a hidden treasure. The house had been vacant for years, and the realtor described it as full of potential. It was 3 stories, dark green with white trim, and had a wraparound porch with a swing that creaked in the wind. The backyard was surrounded by thick trees, giving it a sense of isolation that was both eerie and comforting. I closed on the house quickly. The previous owners had left in a hurry, leaving behind some furniture, books, and a few personal belongings that made the place feel oddly lived in, even though it had been empty. I spent the first few days unpacking and cleaning, trying to make it my own. The creaks and groans of the old floorboards felt natural at first, part of the charm, until the night I realized they didn't always follow logic. It was around 2 in the morning when I first heard it. Soft footsteps on the stairs. I lived alone, and the sound was deliberate, slow. Someone was walking carefully to avoid making noise. I froze, listening. The steps reached the landing, paused, then retreated. I waited for what felt like forever, then convinced myself it was the house settling and went back to sleep. Over the next week, things escalated. Doors I knew I'd locked would be open in the morning. Lights flickered randomly. I started noticing small things moved from where I'd left them. Books, dishes, even shoes. I blamed sleep deprivation and stress, but deep down I felt an unease that wouldn't let go. One evening, I found a door in the attic I hadn't noticed before. It was small, old, and covered in layers of dust. When I opened it, I found a narrow crawl space. Inside, it was dark, damp, and smelled of rot and mildew. At first, I thought it was just a storage space, but then I noticed the scratches along the walls. They weren't random. They looked deliberate, like someone had tried to write something over and over. My stomach turned. I closed the door quickly and didn't mention it to anyone. The nights grew worse. I would wake to whispers, almost imperceptible, coming from the corners of the rooms. Sometimes it sounded like someone was speaking my name. My dog, who I had just adopted, refused to go near the stairs or the attic, barking at invisible presences. I tried to rationalize it. Old houses make noises, I told myself. I'm just paranoid. But then I started seeing shadows. Quick, flickering movements at the edges of my vision, vanishing whenever I turned to look directly. One night, I woke to a cold draft in the bedroom. The air felt thick, heavy, almost suffocating. I sat up and saw a figure at the foot of the bed. Tall, thin, indistinct in the dark, but unmistakably there. My heart pounded, but I couldn't move. The figure lingered for a moment, then disappeared. I never heard it leave. I started sleeping with the lights on. The whispers continued, growing louder, more urgent. Sometimes I would wake to find notes scratched into the wooden floorboards, simple messages like "go" or "don't ignore me." I had never been one to believe in ghosts, but by now I had no other explanation. One evening, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. I grabbed a baseball bat and cautiously opened the door. The hallway was empty, but at the end, the attic door was wide open. I hadn't been up there all day. My stomach knotted as I climbed the stairs. The crawlspace door was now open, and inside, the wall was covered in fresh scratches. Stay with me. I ran out of the house and stayed at a friend's place for a few nights. I couldn't sleep. I could almost hear the house calling to me. Eventually, I returned, convinced I needed to deal with it. But the presence was stronger than ever. Doors slammed on their own. Objects flew across rooms. The shadows became more distinct, and the whispers now formed words I could understand. It told me it was lonely, that the house belonged to it, and that I would be part of it if I didn't leave. I finally accepted I couldn't stay. I packed my belongings and sold the house at a significant loss. I don't know what the previous owners experienced, but I can only assume it was worse than mine. Even now, months later, when I close my eyes at night, I sometimes see shadows moving at the corners of the room. Sometimes I swear I hear whispers calling my name. And every so often I think about that attic, that crawl space, and the message on the wall, and I shiver, knowing I narrowly escaped something I don't understand. Story the end. I had been looking for a new house for months. After years of living in an apartment with thin walls and noisy neighbors, I longed for a place of my own, somewhere quiet and private. I found a house on the outskirts of a small town in Indiana. It was a two-story brick home built in the early 70s with a large yard and a basement that stretched under the entire house. The previous owner had moved out quickly, leaving the place almost untouched, and the price was surprisingly low. I told myself it was just good luck. The first night I slept in one of the upstairs bedrooms. The house was silent in a way that felt unnatural, the kind of silence where every creak of the floorboards seemed magnified. Around 1:30 a.m., I woke to a soft, shuffling sound from the hallway outside. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened. The sound stopped. I told myself it was the house settling and tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Over the next week, small things began to happen. Items would be moved from where I left them: keys, books, even a pair of shoes. Doors that I was certain I had closed would be left slightly ajar. I tried to dismiss it as absent-mindedness, but a growing sense of unease gnawed at me. Then the noises started. Footsteps in the hallways, faint whispers from the walls, and sometimes soft breathing right behind me when no one was there. My dog, normally calm, began growling at corners of the house and refusing to go into certain rooms. Once, I heard a door creak open in the basement, even though I had locked it. I contacted the previous owner to ask if they had experienced anything unusual. She hesitated, then admitted that she had left because she couldn't sleep at night. "Something is in that house," she said. "It doesn't like anyone staying too long." From then on, the occurrences escalated. One night, I woke to see a dark figure standing at the end of the hallway. I froze, unable to move. The figure didn't advance, but I felt its eyes on me, cold and heavy. When I finally screamed, it vanished. Another night, I woke in the middle of a storm to the sound of water dripping in the basement. I went downstairs to check, and the basement light flickered on by itself. I saw shadows moving along the walls, twisting and stretching, though nothing was there. The air was frigid, and I could see my breath. I ran upstairs, slammed the basement door, and locked it, but the sound of scratching continued from behind it. Eventually, I couldn't stay. I packed my essentials and left, staying in a motel while arranging for the sale of the house. Movers reported strange things when they came to collect my belongings: doors opening and closing on their own, cold spots that made their skin crawl, and a feeling of being watched. They refused to enter the basement and told me they found an old, rusted key on the stairs that I had never seen. Even after leaving, the house lingered in my mind. I dreamed of the footsteps, the whispers, the cold presence that seemed to follow me. I sometimes wake in the night certain I feel its gaze, heavy and unrelenting. I don't know what was in that house, and I don't want to know. Some places are not meant to be lived in, and some of them never truly let you go. Story the end. I remember the first time I set foot in the house. It was late autumn, the air crisp and the leaves turning orange and red. My husband David and I had been searching for months, wanting a home with space for our two kids, a yard for them to play in, and a quiet neighborhood where we could finally settle down. When we saw the listing for a large colonial on the outskirts of a small town in Connecticut, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: hope. The house looked perfect from the outside: white siding, black shutters, a porch that wrapped around the front, and a long driveway lined with maples. The realtor was eager to show it, and we barely stepped inside before I knew I wanted it. Hardwood floors, high ceilings, a fireplace in the living room, and a kitchen with enough space to cook for a family of 4. We made an offer immediately. The sellers accepted within a week, and before we knew it, we were moving in. The first few nights were ordinary enough: boxes everywhere, kids running through the rooms, and the usual creaks of a house settling. But on the 4th night, I woke to a sound that made my stomach twist. It was faint at first, a scratching like fingernails across wood. I sat up in bed, listening. It was coming from the hallway outside our bedroom. David was asleep beside me, so I assumed it was my imagination and tried to go back to sleep. Over the next few days, the occurrences became more frequent. Doors would be open that I had closed, lights would flicker, and sometimes objects would move slightly from where we'd left them. The kids mentioned hearing whispers in their rooms at night. I tried to rationalize everything. Old houses make noises. Kids have vivid imaginations. But the sense of unease kept growing. One evening, while unpacking in the basement, I discovered a small door hidden behind some shelves. It was barely more than 3 feet high, with a rusted latch. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. Inside was a narrow crawl space. The air was damp and smelled of earth and mildew. I shone my flashlight inside and saw scratches on the walls, deep and jagged, almost like they had been made by claws. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickly shut the door. That night, I had a dream. I was crawling through that same space, the walls closing in around me. I could hear something breathing heavily behind me. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. From that point on, the strange activity escalated. I began hearing whispers, sometimes unintelligible, sometimes calling my name. My daughter said she saw a man in her room, standing by the closet, though when we checked, no one was there. David still brushed it off, but I could see the worry creeping into his eyes, too. One particularly cold night, I was in the kitchen when I felt a presence behind me. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Then I saw it. A shadow moving against the wall, tall and thin, with a face I couldn't make out. It didn't move toward me, didn't speak, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The basement door began opening on its own. Our dog refused to go down there, growling and backing away. The kids became restless and anxious, often waking in the middle of the night, crying about voices or shadows. I tried to research the history of the house, and what I found unsettled me further. The house had changed owners multiple times over the past 20 years, each family staying no more than a couple of years before selling. There were rumors of strange occurrences, disappearances of pets, unexplained noises, and even sightings of a shadowy figure in the hallways. One night, I woke to find words scratched into the wooden floorboards near our bedroom. "You belong to me." I screamed, and David ran in, but the message was gone when he turned on the lights. We stayed up the rest of the night, barricading ourselves in our room. When morning came, we decided to leave, even if just temporarily. We stayed in a hotel for a week, trying to gather our thoughts and recover from the fear that had taken over our home. When we returned to collect our belongings, the house felt heavier somehow. The air was thick, almost oppressive. I made one last trip to the basement to retrieve some boxes, and the crawlspace door was open again. Inside, scratched into the dirt floor, were new words. "Don't leave me." That was the final straw. We sold the house at a loss and moved far away. But even now, months later, when I lie in bed at night, I sometimes hear faint scratching, faint whispers, and I wonder if the house is still waiting, patient and hungry, for its next family. Story the end. When we first toured the house, it felt perfect. A 3-story Victorian in upstate New York, painted a faded shade of yellow that somehow made it look inviting rather than old. My wife, Claire, and I had been searching for months, hoping to find a place where our lives could feel like they were starting fresh. The realtor mentioned that the house had been empty for nearly a year, but otherwise she only spoke of its charming character. We overlooked the fact that no one had lived there for so long. Moving in was chaotic, as any move is. The kids, Jason and Emily, were running from room to room, claiming which spaces they would take. The first night was quiet. We slept peacefully, lulled by the creaks and groans of the old house. But by the third night, I woke to the sound of soft murmuring coming from the hallway outside our bedroom. I thought it was Claire talking in her sleep, but when I nudged her, she was snoring soundly. The murmuring stopped as abruptly as it had started. The next morning, Emily said she had seen a man in the hallway. She described him as tall and thin, wearing dark clothes, but when I checked, there was nothing there. I tried to brush it off as a dream, but the unease in her eyes was unmistakable. Jason, normally fearless, started sleeping with the light on and refused to go into the attic, claiming someone was hiding there. It began with small things. Items moved around the house, books from shelves ending up on the floor, chairs slightly out of place, doors that were closed in the evening found wide open in the morning. Claire said she felt watched when she cooked alone, though the house was empty. I started hearing footsteps at night, slow and deliberate, pacing the hallway outside our bedroom. One evening, I decided to investigate the attic. I climbed up the ladder and flicked on the light. The air was stale and thick with dust. Most of the boxes were old, from previous owners, but tucked in a corner was a small collection of items that chilled me. Children's toys, tiny shoes, and a journal, yellowed with age. Opening it, I found entries from someone who had lived there decades before. The writing became increasingly erratic, speaking of voices in the walls, shadows that moved, and a presence that watched the family. I shut the book quickly and put it back, convincing myself it was just old paranoia. That night, Emily woke screaming. She said a man was in her room, standing by the foot of her bed. I ran in, flipping on the light, but there was nothing. Jason later told me he had seen the same figure lurking in the hallway, peeking around corners. The unease was no longer something I could ignore. Then came the whispers. Soft, almost inaudible, coming from the walls and ceilings. They would repeat fragments of words, my name, Claire's name, Jason and Emily's names. Sometimes they sounded urgent, sometimes malicious. One night I heard a clear whisper in my ear while lying in bed. You can't leave. I bolted upright, but there was no one there. Objects began to appear in strange places. A knife found in the middle of the living room floor, a chair turned upside down in the dining room, toys arranged in circles on the floor. The kids became increasingly frightened. They would refuse to be alone in their rooms, sometimes sleeping between Claire and me in terror. One evening, I returned home early from work to find the front door wide open. I was certain I had locked it before leaving. Inside, the house was unnaturally cold. The smell of smoke filled the air, even though nothing was burning. Upstairs, I found the attic ladder pulled down, swinging gently as though someone had climbed it recently. My hands shook as I ascended. There, in the far corner, was a figure, a tall man, hunched, head bowed. I froze, heart hammering. When I blinked, he was gone, leaving behind an icy chill and a sense of dread I've never felt before or since. Claire and I decided that night that we couldn't stay. The children were terrified, and so were we. We packed what we could and stayed with relatives while making arrangements to sell the house. But even after we left, strange things continued. Our phones sometimes picked up static, followed by faint whispers. Dreams were haunted by tall shadows and watching eyes. Even our new home felt tainted, like the presence had followed us, lurking at the edges of perception. I've tried to rationalize it all. Perhaps it was stress, perhaps the house was full of old memories and settling noises, or perhaps we simply imagined it. But I know what I experienced, and so do my children. Even now, years later, I can't walk past an old Victorian without feeling my stomach twist and my pulse quicken. I remember the eyes in the attic, the whispers in the hallways, and the children's terrified faces. Some places carry their own histories. Some houses hold on to what should have been forgotten, and some presences never leave, no matter how far you run. Story the end. We had been looking for our first house for months, scanning listings online, touring open houses on weekends, and comparing every detail. When we finally found a modest 2-story house on the edge of a quiet New England town, it seemed perfect. Brick exterior, large windows, an attic, and a basement, finished by the previous owners. It had been on the market for a while, which gave us a good price, and the neighborhood was quiet. Too quiet, maybe, but we ignored that at first. The first night in the house was oddly still. Aaron and I unpacked boxes, trying to make it feel like home. The air smelled faintly of damp wood, like the house had been closed up for weeks. Cooper, our golden retriever, seemed uneasy, pacing back and forth, sniffing corners, refusing to settle. We chalked it up to stress. He had just come from a shelter, after all, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he sensed something we didn't. It started with small things. At night, we would hear footsteps upstairs, slow and deliberate. The stairs creaked under invisible weight, and sometimes, just sometimes, we would hear a whisper, "Get out." At first, we thought it was the neighbors, maybe kids playing or drafts making the house groan, but there were no neighbors close enough to make that sound, and the whisper came from inside the walls. The basement was colder than it should have been, and the lights flickered at random. I would go down to check the fuse box and feel a heavy chill brush past me. Aaron refused to go alone, and even Cooper wouldn't follow. I started sleeping with a baseball by my bed, half expecting to wake to an intruder, but it was never an intruder we could see. One day, while unpacking the basement, Aaron found a hidden cavity behind the drywall of a closet. Inside was a small, rusted wooden box. The box contained a rusted key, a faded photograph of the house from decades ago, and a single slip of paper with one word written in smudged ink, "Leave." Aaron laughed nervously, trying to convince me it was some old prank left by previous owners. I wasn't so sure. That night, the activity escalated. Doors slammed on their own, lights flickered violently, and we heard 3 distinct knocks on the wall behind the closet. Cooper barked and growled, staring at a spot where nothing seemed to be. Then we heard it. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps coming up the stairs. My heart raced. I grabbed the baseball bat and we both froze as the footsteps stopped just outside our bedroom. I opened the door. Nothing. Just the empty hallway, but the air felt heavy, oppressive, like something had been watching us all along. Over the next few weeks, the incidents became more personal. Erin woke with scratches along her arms, thin, angry red lines that weren't there before she went to sleep. I heard whispers calling my name when I was alone in the kitchen, and sometimes I would find objects moved in ways we hadn't touched them. The house seemed to be alive, aware of us, growing more hostile each day. Then came the night we knew we couldn't stay. Erin woke screaming, trapped by something unseen. She clawed at the air, gasping, and I could feel the invisible pressure around her throat. I pulled her free, but her neck was marked with deep, bruised impressions. That was it. We packed a bag and left immediately, leaving nearly everything behind, the furniture, our clothes, even the dog's bed. We never returned. Weeks later, I went back in daylight to retrieve a few essentials, but the house was silent, normal even. The basement still held that icy chill, and when I checked behind the panel again, the wooden box was gone. The realtor later told me the house had been sold multiple times, with previous families leaving abruptly, citing vague reasons like we couldn't stay there or felt uncomfortable. The house remains on that quiet street. The neighborhood looks peaceful, welcoming even, but something inside waits. It watches. It waits for the next family who thinks they've found their dream home, unaware of the presence that lingers in the shadows, in the walls, in the basement where the air is always colder than it should be. Story the end. We had been looking for months, scanning listings, visiting homes, anything that would give us a chance to leave the city and raise our daughter in a quieter place. When we first drove up to the house in rural Ohio, it felt like a dream. It was a modest 2-story home with a wraparound porch, white siding, and dark green shutters. The yard was overgrown, but that only added to the charm. My husband Jake and I both fell in love immediately. The realtor mentioned it had been empty for years and the previous owners had left in a hurry, but neither of us thought much of it. The first few nights were strange, not terrifying, just odd. At first, it was the subtle things, the house settling, a floorboard creaking in an empty room, the wind whistling through a loose window. But there was also a feeling, a heaviness that pressed against you, especially in the bedrooms. Emily, my daughter, was too young to speak in full sentences, but sometimes she would point at corners of the room and giggle or babble, saying "there," as if someone were there. Jake and I laughed nervously, trying to chalk it up to imagination. A week after moving in, I was alone in the kitchen when I noticed the pantry door was open. I had closed it that morning. I shrugged it off, thinking I must have left it ajar, but then I noticed the floor near the door. There were faint scuff marks, like someone had dragged their feet. I bent down, brushing them with my fingers, and felt a cold dampness that made my skin crawl. Over the next few weeks, the disturbances grew. Doors would open on their own, lights would flicker, and I could hear whispering when I was alone. The first truly terrifying moment came late one night. I was putting Emily to bed when I heard the slow creak of the staircase. I called out to Jake, but he didn't answer. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, deliberate and heavy, moving across the living room floor. I froze, listening, convinced someone had broken in. But when Jake appeared in the doorway, he looked as scared as I felt. "I heard it too," he whispered. "It's like something's walking around." We started sleeping with lights on and doors locked, but that didn't stop it. One night, Emily woke up screaming. We ran to her room to find her crib rocking violently, even though the window was shut and the wind was calm. She pointed at the corner and cried, "No, go away." Jake and I exchanged a look we didn't need words for. That was it. We were done pretending. We researched the house's history and discovered the previous owners had left abruptly, without explanation. Some old newspaper clippings hinted at a tragedy, but the details were scarce. I started noticing patterns. The disturbances were worse at night, especially in rooms that had been bedrooms before. The basement was the worst. A damp, musty space with exposed beams and pipes, it had a strange, oppressive energy. I avoided going down there alone, but I couldn't ignore it forever. One evening, I had to check the fuse box. The stairs creaked under my weight, and I felt the temperature drop the second I stepped into the basement. Shadows clung to the corners, moving just out of the reach of the single bare bulb. Then I heard it, a low whisper right behind me. I spun, but nothing was there. The hairs on my arms stood on end as I scrambled back upstairs, promising myself I would never go down there alone again. Emily began having nightmares almost every night. She would cry for hours, pointing at things that weren't there. Sometimes she would babble about the lady or the man in the corners. Jake and I tried to comfort her, but the fear that had settled in our own hearts made it hard to pretend we weren't terrified too. By the time winter arrived, the house had taken its toll. Sleep was impossible. The air felt thicker, the shadows darker. One stormy night, Jake woke me in a panic. He had been pulled from the bed by something unseen. The room was freezing, and a presence pressed against us both, heavy and suffocating. We left immediately, packing only what we could carry. Even after moving, the house continued to haunt us. Every so often I would dream of the shadows, the cold, the whispering. Emily would wake up crying, saying, "I saw her," or "He's back." It was a relief to be gone, but a small, persistent part of us knew the house hadn't let us go. We sold it quickly to a young couple who seemed eager for a fixer-upper. We didn't warn them, though sometimes I wonder if they ever noticed the rocking chair moving on its own or the faint whispers in the hallways at night. I'll never forget that house. Even now, years later, I feel that same cold weight pressing down on me when I close my eyes too long. Story the end. I had been searching for months for the right house, and when I stumbled across the listing online, I felt like I had hit the jackpot. A 3-bedroom, 2-bath colonial in a sleepy American suburb, priced way below market value. The photos showed a wide front porch, big windows letting in streams of sunlight, and an overgrown backyard that promised privacy. The description mentioned charming, original details and ideal for a first-time homeowner. I was tired of cramped apartments and noisy neighbors, so I jumped at it. The day I moved in, the air inside felt strangely cold, even though it was a warm afternoon. The realtor kept talking about the character of the house, her words barely registering. There was a musty smell, faintly earthy, like damp wood. I brushed it off, telling myself that old houses always smelled funny. The first night was uneventful, at least until I woke up around 2 a.m. to a faint scratching sound coming from the living room. I told myself it was the house settling, but the sound was too regular, too deliberate, like nails scraping against the wooden floor. I lay there, heart pounding, listening as the sound slowly made its way up the stairs toward my bedroom. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it, but a part of me couldn't ignore the feeling that someone or something was moving through the house. The next morning, I found a box of books in the living room that I was sure I had stacked neatly in the study the night before had been pulled apart, pages scattered across the floor. I tried to chalk it up to the movers being careless, but no one else had keys yet. As days passed, the occurrences became more frequent and harder to dismiss. Doors I was sure I had locked would be wide open in the mornings. Once, I came home from work to find the kitchen lights on and the radio playing softly, even though I had turned everything off before leaving. A faint chill settled in the hallways, one that never seemed to go away no matter how many heaters I turned on. One evening, my friend Sarah came over for dinner. I didn't tell her about the strange events, thinking it might be stress. But while we were eating, she froze mid-sentence, staring at the corner of the living room. "What is it?" I asked. "There's someone there," she whispered. I looked, but the room was empty. The shadows in the corner seemed to twist unnaturally, as if absorbing the light from the lamps. I forced a laugh and tried to dismiss it, but I could see the unease in her eyes. Later that night, I was brushing my teeth in the upstairs bathroom when I caught movement in the mirror behind me. A man, tall and pale, stood in the hallway. I spun around, but there was nothing. I ran to the bedroom and slammed the door, locking it. Sleep didn't come that night. Over the next week, the house became increasingly hostile. The basement was unbearable. Each time I descended, the single bulb flickered, casting jagged shadows across the walls. Objects seemed to move on their own, just slightly, enough to be noticed but easy to dismiss. But the whispers began, the low, sibilant murmurs calling my name when I was alone. One night, during a storm, the power went out completely. Candles provided little comfort as the wind rattled the windows. Around 1 a.m., I heard footsteps again, slow, heavy, deliberate, coming up the stairs. They stopped outside my bedroom door. I froze, holding my breath, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. Emily. The whisper was right at my ear. I bolted upright, the door trembling from the faint pressure of an unseen hand. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, just listened as the sound faded into silence. Morning light finally came, and the house seemed to exhale, returning to an uneasy calm. I called the realtor, demanding answers. She hesitated, then reluctantly told me the house had a grim history. Years ago, a man had died in the upstairs bedroom under mysterious circumstances. Subsequent tenants rarely stayed longer than a few months. I hadn't known, and now I understood why. I started sleeping with all the lights on, doors locked, and even then I could feel it watching me. Shadows shifted when I wasn't looking. Objects moved, and the faint whispering never stopped. The house was alive in a way I couldn't explain, and it was aware of me. Some nights I hear the slow creaking of stairs even when I'm sure I'm alone. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of pale figures at the end of the hallway or reflected in mirrors. The house doesn't just contain me, it watches, waits, and makes its presence known in the most subtle, terrifying ways. I don't know if I can ever leave. The thought of abandoning it terrifies me, as if the house would follow, as if it wouldn't let me go. Every day, every hour, I am reminded, I am never truly alone here. Story the end. The first time I stepped into the house, I remember being caught off guard by how quiet it was. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, but instead heavy, like something was pressing down on the walls, muffling the air. My wife, Claire, was already wandering through the living room, her fingers brushing over the edges of the fireplace mantel, her voice carrying that tone of cautious excitement. "It's got character," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. We had been searching for months, and this house came up almost unexpectedly. The price was suspiciously low for the neighborhood. 2 stories, 4 bedrooms, a yard big enough for the kids to run around in. When the realtor mentioned the seller was motivated because they wanted to leave town quickly, I didn't think too much about it. Claire was already picturing furniture placement where the Christmas tree would go, how she could plant roses in the front. The kids, Michael and Sarah, were racing up the staircase before we had even signed a paper. "This can be my room," Sarah had shouted from the second floor. Michael, older by 2 years, shouted back from another doorway, "No, this one's bigger. I call it." Their laughter echoed strangely in the empty rooms. That was 3 months ago. I still remember the first night after moving in. We didn't have everything set up, and boxes were stacked against the walls. The air smelled faintly of dust and something older, like wood that had been damp once but dried into a musty permanence. We had pizza for dinner, sitting on the living room floor. The kids fought over slices, Claire kept laughing, and for a moment, everything felt exactly the way a new house should, a fresh start. But when night fell, and we lay down on the mattress that we had dragged upstairs to the master bedroom, that silence returned. I could hear the house breathing, groaning wood, shifting pipes. I told myself it was just age. But somewhere around 2 in the morning, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The house was still, but the air felt off, colder than it had been. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Light, deliberate, creaking against the floorboards just down the hall. My body stiffened, and I held my breath, listening. Claire shifted in her sleep beside me, completely unaware. I told myself it had to be Michael or Sarah, maybe one of them up to get a drink of water or looking for the bathroom in the dark. But the steps weren't rushed. They weren't the careless shuffling of a kid. They were slow. Too slow. I sat up, straining to hear. They paused, then started again, closer this time. I forced myself to move, climbing out of bed as quietly as I could. When I opened the bedroom door, the hallway stretched out in both directions, shadows cut by the faint glow of the nightlight we had plugged in for the kids. Nothing. I checked both kids' rooms. Sarah was curled up with her stuffed rabbit, breathing softly. Michael was sprawled on his stomach, mouth open in a deep sleep. I stood there for a long moment, just listening. The house was quiet again, too quiet. I convinced myself it was just settling noises, maybe even my half-dreaming brain exaggerating things. I crawled back into bed and forced myself to sleep. But it didn't stop. The noises came again the next night and the night after. Sometimes footsteps, sometimes faint knocking, sometimes the sound of what I swear was whispering just outside our door. Claire laughed when I mentioned it over breakfast. Old houses make sounds, that's all. You're letting it get in your head. But Michael wasn't sleeping well either. One morning he came down with dark circles under his eyes, and when I asked, he said, "Someone kept walking in the hallway. It woke me up." I tried not to let him see my unease, just told him it was the house creaking. It escalated slowly, the way rot spreads under the surface of wood. Doors would be open in the morning that I knew we had shut the night before. A framed picture of our wedding slid from the mantel one afternoon and shattered. Sarah started complaining about the man in the corner of her room at night. When we asked what man, she grew flustered and said he just stands there, near the closet, watching. That night, Claire insisted we leave her door cracked open with the hallway light on. I started to notice small things. The air in certain rooms would feel colder, heavy in my chest. The smell, too, sometimes faintly metallic, sometimes like earth after rain, even though the windows were closed. I caught movement in my periphery often, a shadow ducking just as I turned, the impression of someone crossing the hall when no one was there. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, Claire and I sat downstairs on the couch. She was flipping through her phone when we both heard it. A heavy thud upstairs, then the unmistakable sound of running footsteps. We bolted up the stairs, convinced one of the kids had fallen. But both were in bed, startled awake by our entrance, swearing they hadn't moved. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the hallway with a baseball bat across my lap, staring into the shadows. Nothing came, but the oppressive feeling of being watched never left. It wasn't long before I began to dread nightfall. The worst was what happened about a month after moving in. I woke again around 2 a.m. This time, the sound was different. Not footsteps, not whispering, breathing. It was deep and steady, coming from just beside the bed. I froze, every muscle locking, my skin crawling with the kind of fear that makes your teeth ache. Slowly, I turned my head, expecting, dreading to see someone standing there. Nothing. But the breathing didn't stop. I reached over and shook Claire awake, whispering that something was wrong. She sat up, listening, and for a moment her face drained of color. She heard it too, but when she switched on the lamp, the sound vanished. Neither of us slept the rest of the night. The next day, Claire admitted she'd started hearing things herself when she was alone in the house. A man's voice, low, muttering from another room, though she could never make out the words, sometimes humming, like a song without melody. We didn't tell the kids, but kids know more than you think. Sarah refused to sleep in her room after that, insisting she saw the man again, only this time he was closer to her bed. Michael tried to act braver, but one morning he asked me if it was possible for a house to not like us. By the second month, sleep deprivation had dug into all of us. Claire and I fought over little things. The kids grew more withdrawn. Even the daylight hours weren't peaceful anymore. I began noticing strange marks in the house. At first, just faint scratches on the wood of the banister, like something with claws had dragged along it. Then on the walls, tiny etchings that I didn't remember being there before. One morning in the basement, I found something carved into the concrete near the furnace. Crude, uneven letters that spelled out a word I wish I hadn't read. Stay. That was the first time I truly considered leaving. But moving isn't easy, and Claire tried to convince me that it was just our imagination feeding into itself, that the stress of moving, money worries, and lack of sleep were making us paranoid. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to. Then came the night we both saw him. We were in the kitchen finishing dishes when I looked up toward the doorway. For the briefest moment, a man stood there, tall, shoulders slumped, head tilted slightly to one side as though broken. His face was pale, eyes black hollows that caught the light but gave nothing back. And then he was gone. Claire dropped the plate she was holding, shattering it on the floor. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. After that, things spiraled. The noises grew louder, the appearances more frequent, lights flickered, objects moved. Sometimes in the darkest hours of night, we'd wake to the sound of our children screaming, convinced something was in their rooms. We called a priest. He came, walked through the house, said prayers. For a while, it seemed calmer, but the silence afterward was worse, like the house was waiting. The last straw came 3 weeks ago. It was a stormy night, rain hammering against the roof, wind rattling the windows. I woke to Sarah's scream. Bolting from the bed, I nearly collided with Claire in the hallway as we both ran to her room. She was sitting upright, shaking violently, pointing at the closet. "He was here," she sobbed. "He was coming out of the closet." The closet door was open. Inside, the darkness was thicker than it should have been, like it absorbed the hallway light instead of reflecting it. I stepped inside with the bat, every hair on my neck standing up. It was empty. But when I turned back toward the door, I saw him again. Not in the hallway, behind Sarah, standing by her bed. I lunged forward, swinging the bat, but it went through him like air. Sarah shrieked. Claire grabbed her, and we all stumbled out of the room. That night, we locked ourselves in the master bedroom, all four of us. The storm raged, the house creaked, and somewhere in the dark we heard scratching at the door. We haven't slept properly since. We're making arrangements to leave, even if it ruins us financially. The house doesn't want us here. Every night it gets worse, like it's feeding off us, growing stronger. I don't know who the man is or what he wants, but I know this. The house isn't empty. It never was. And if we stay any longer, I don't think it'll let us leave at all. Story the end. When my wife and I bought the house, it felt like a fresh start. We had spent nearly a decade in a 2-bedroom apartment in the city, listening to our upstairs neighbors fight, babies cry through the walls, and traffic echo down the street outside. When we first pulled up to the property, it felt like a dream come true. The house was a classic 2-story colonial with white siding and blue shutters, sitting back from the road with a long driveway and enough trees to give us some privacy. It wasn't new by any means. The realtor told us it had been built in the late 1940s, but the charm of it drew us in immediately. The deal almost seemed too good to be true. The asking price was lower than we expected for the neighborhood, especially considering the size of the lot and the fact that the previous owners had left the place fully furnished. They just wanted to move quickly, the realtor explained with a bright smile flipping through her folder. They relocated for work out of state, and they didn't want to deal with moving the furniture, so it's all included if you want it. I remember my wife, Melissa, squeezing my hand in excitement. We were both exhausted from years of trying and failing to find a place we could afford that didn't look like it was falling apart. This one didn't seem perfect, but it felt right. The first time we walked inside, there was a faint musty smell like old books and something that had been shut away too long. The realtor brushed it off, saying the house had been closed up for a while and just needed fresh air. We nodded, eager not to overthink. The hardwood floors creaked under our feet as we explored room after room. The kitchen had outdated tile, but the dining room opened into a spacious living room with a brick fireplace. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms waited for us, each with antique furniture, beds neatly made as if someone had just left moments before. The house had character, and I liked that. Melissa, ever the practical one, voiced her only concern when we stepped into the basement. The air was cooler there, damp, with a smell that reminded me of wet concrete. Old wooden shelves lined the walls, and in the far corner, a single light bulb hung over a workbench covered in rusted tools. "Creepy," Melissa muttered, hugging herself. I laughed and said, "It's a basement. They're supposed to be creepy." We signed the paperwork a week later. Moving in was a whirlwind. Friends helped us load boxes into the U-Haul, and by nightfall we were exhausted, surrounded by stacks of our things in the new living room. We ordered pizza, cracked open beers, and toasted to finally being homeowners. That night, after our friends left, Melissa and I sat in the living room with just the glow of the fireplace and talked about how different our lives would be here. For the first time in years, I felt peace. That feeling didn't last long. It started with small things. The first morning after we moved in, I woke before Melissa and went downstairs to make coffee. As I passed the living room, I froze. One of the armchairs, the big blue one that had come with the house, was facing the fireplace. That wasn't how it had been when we went to bed. I distinctly remembered moving it to face the couch because it blocked the view of the TV. I told myself Melissa must have done it without thinking, but when I asked her later, she shook her head. "I didn't touch it," she said, yawning as she buttered toast. The following night, we heard what sounded like footsteps upstairs while we were in the kitchen. Heavy, slow steps crossing the floor above us. We both went quiet, listening. I grabbed a flashlight and went up, but the rooms were empty. I checked every corner, even under the beds, and found nothing. "The house is just settling," I told her, though my heart was pounding. A few days later, Melissa called me at work. Her voice was shaky. "The front door was open when I came downstairs," she said. "I know I locked it last night, and I always double-check in the morning before you leave." I left work early that day and replaced the locks, telling myself it was better to be safe than sorry. But the incidents grew harder to explain. One evening, Melissa and I were watching TV when the sound of someone walking in the upstairs hallway made both of us go silent. It wasn't faint this time. It was clear, like someone pacing back and forth just above us. Melissa gripped my arm. "Please tell me you hear that," she whispered. I nodded, grabbed the flashlight again, and went upstairs. Halfway up the staircase, I swear I felt the air change. It was colder, heavier. My breath caught in my throat, but I kept going. At the top of the stairs, everything was still. The hallway was empty, the doors closed just as we'd left them. I stood there for a long time, listening. Nothing. When I came back down, Melissa's face was pale. "There was someone up there," she said firmly. "I know there was." We started sleeping with the bedroom door locked after that. 2 weeks into living there, I had my first dream about the house. I don't usually remember my dreams, but this one was vivid. I dreamed I was in the basement, standing at the workbench. The single bulb above me flickered, and in the shadows I saw someone standing at the far end of the room. I couldn't make out their face, but I knew they were staring at me. When I tried to move, my legs wouldn't work. The figure stepped forward slowly, dragging something metallic across the floor. The screeching sound echoed in my head until I woke up in a cold sweat, heart racing. When I told Melissa, she looked at me strangely. "I had a dream too," she whispered. I was in the bedroom, but when I looked in the mirror, it wasn't me looking back. It was someone else. That was the first time I felt true unease about the house. Things escalated quickly after that. One evening, Melissa was in the shower when I heard her scream. I ran upstairs and found her clutching a towel, pale and shaking. "The mirror," she gasped. "I swear for a second, it wasn't me. My face, it wasn't my face." I tried to calm her down, telling her it was the steam or her imagination, but I couldn't shake the look of terror in her eyes. Around the same time, I started noticing odd details I couldn't account for. The blue armchair would move again, always angled toward the fireplace as if someone had been sitting there watching. The basement light would be on when neither of us had been down there. At night, we would both wake to the sound of creaking steps on the staircase, sometimes pausing just outside our locked bedroom door. One night, I woke to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was Melissa, but when I turned, she was fast asleep beside me. The whispering was coming from the corner of the room, low and urgent, though I couldn't make out the words. I froze, my chest tight, until it stopped. The next morning, I found Melissa staring at the same corner. When I asked what she was doing, she said softly, "Sometimes I feel like someone's standing there." I wanted to believe it was stress, our minds playing tricks on us. Moving into a new place is overwhelming, but then came the night we both saw it. We were sitting in the living room, the fire crackling, when Melissa suddenly stiffened. Her eyes widened, and she pointed toward the hallway that led to the kitchen. "Did you see that?" she whispered. I turned, and for the briefest second, I saw what she meant. A shadow, darker than the rest, slipping past the doorway. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was the shape of a person. I jumped up and ran into the hallway, but it was empty. My skin crawled. When I turned back, Melissa was shaking. "We're not alone in this house," she said. After that, the house didn't feel like ours anymore. It felt like we were intruders. The final straw came late one night when Melissa shook me awake. "Listen," she whispered. I sat up, heart pounding, and then I heard it. A dragging sound coming from the basement. Slow, heavy, like something being pulled across the concrete floor. We both sat frozen, staring at the bedroom door. The sound went on for what felt like forever, then stopped. I knew I should go down and check, but every part of me screamed not to. Instead, we stayed awake until dawn, holding each other. The next morning, I forced myself to go into the basement. The shelves were untouched, the tools scattered as before. But when I turned toward the corner where I'd seen the figure in my dream, my blood ran cold. There were long, fresh drag marks on the floor, cutting through the dust straight toward the workbench. Melissa begged me to move after that. "This house isn't right," she said, her voice breaking. "It doesn't want us here." We lasted another week before we packed up and left. We told ourselves it was temporary, that we'd stay at her sister's until we figured things out. But deep down, I knew we weren't going back. Not after what we'd experienced. Sometimes late at night, I still dream about the house. I see the blue armchair by the fire, facing the empty room. I see the basement light swinging, shadows moving just out of sight, and I wake with the certainty that whatever lived in that house is still there, waiting for someone else to move in. Story the end. Moving into the house felt like the start of something new. I had been renting apartments in the city for years, always hearing footsteps above me, dealing with neighbors who fought through thin walls, and watching my rent climb with no end in sight. When I stumbled across a 3-bedroom house listed for a price I could actually afford, I thought it was a stroke of luck. It was older, built sometime in the 1960s according to the paperwork, but solid. Brick exterior, big backyard with an oak tree that nearly touched the sky, and a basement that stretched under the entire footprint of the house. It was far bigger than I needed, but I told myself I'd grow into it. The realtor kept describing it as a home with character. That was her way of selling the scuffed wooden floors, the odd narrow staircase that creaked no matter how lightly you stepped, and the strange draft in the hallway even when all the windows were shut. She joked that the house just liked to breathe. I laughed politely and told myself that old houses all had quirks. The first night, I slept on a mattress on the floor of the main bedroom. My furniture was still in the moving truck scheduled for delivery the following morning, but I didn't want to waste money on another night in my apartment. The silence struck me more than anything. After years of hearing sirens, honking, and people shouting at all hours, the quiet pressed in on me. It wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that made you aware of every creak in the wood, every shift of the wind outside. Around 2 a.m, I woke to the sound of movement in the house. It wasn't loud, not like footsteps crashing through the hallway, but it was deliberate. A soft shifting like weight pressed against old wood. I held my breath, telling myself it was the house settling. Still, I couldn't ignore the prickling on the back of my neck. It felt like someone was standing in the doorway, watching me. I didn't look. I rolled onto my side, pulled the blanket over my shoulder, and forced myself to drift back to sleep. The next day, with the movers bustling through the house, the fear from the night before seemed childish. I told myself exhaustion had made me imagine things. The movers brought in my furniture, my boxes, and filled the empty space with life. Still, I noticed they were uneasy in the basement. One of the movers, a heavy-set guy with a shaved head, glanced around when he carried a box down there and muttered, "Man, this place is creepy." His partner laughed and told him to hurry up, but I caught the way he quickly rushed back up the stairs. Once everything was in place and the house was mine to settle into, the oddities began to pile up. Little things at first, lights flickering even after I replaced the bulbs, a tapping sound in the walls that didn't match the rhythm of pipes or rodents, and always that draft in the hallway. I called a handyman to check the insulation, but he couldn't find a cause. "Probably just the way the air moves through these older houses," he said, though he looked puzzled while he said it. I tried to ignore it all. Weeks passed, and I started to notice something more disturbing. Items weren't where I had left them. My keys moved from the counter to the table. A picture frame I had placed on a shelf was turned to face the wall one morning. I thought I was being forgetful, maybe more stressed than I realized from the move. But then, one night I heard it again, the sound that had woken me that first night. This time, it wasn't subtle. I was lying in bed when the unmistakable creak of footsteps traveled slowly down the hallway toward my bedroom. My blood went cold. I stared at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I was dreaming, but the sound grew closer. The boards groaned under weight, deliberate and heavy. I reached for my phone, ready to call the police, when the footsteps stopped just outside my door. The knob didn't turn. Nothing moved. I lay frozen for what felt like an eternity before I found the courage to get up. My hands shook as I turned on the light, flooding the room with brightness. The hallway was empty when I opened the door. Nothing. The air was icy cold, the draft stronger than ever. I barely slept that night, and when the sun came up, I convinced myself it had been a nightmare. But it kept happening. Some nights, I'd hear the steps pacing the hall. Other nights, it sounded like something was moving in the basement, a dragging sound that echoed faintly up the stairs. Once, when I was in the kitchen, I heard someone sigh right behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. I started leaving lights on at night, but it didn't help. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. My dog, who had always been calm, started growling at the hallway, her hackles raised, teeth bared. She refused to go near the basement door. One night, she barked furiously at it, her body shaking, until I pulled her away. That was the first night I locked the basement door. The lock didn't matter. I woke around 3 a.m. to the sound of the basement door opening. The hinges squealed, the sound echoing through the house. My stomach dropped. I had locked it. I knew I had. The dog whimpered and hid under the bed. Then the footsteps started up the basement stairs, slow and deliberate. I didn't wait. I ran to my bedroom window, threw it open, and jumped onto the grass below. I didn't even grab my phone. I sprinted to the street, barefoot, until I found a neighbor's house with a porch light on. I banged on the door until a man in his 50s opened it, startled. He let me in, and I told him someone was in my house. He called the police. The officers searched every room. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing out of place. I kept insisting the basement door had opened, but they told me the lock wasn't broken. One of them asked if I'd been under stress lately, maybe not sleeping well. I could tell they didn't believe me. I stayed at the neighbor's house until morning. When I returned, everything was as I'd left it, except for one detail. On the kitchen table, in the center where I never left anything, sat a single old-fashioned key. I had never seen it before. After that, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I started researching the history of the house. Public records showed it had changed owners frequently. No one had stayed longer than a few years. I tracked down a previous tenant through a social media search. When I messaged her, she replied with only one sentence: "You need to leave before it makes you stay." I stared at the message for hours, my skin crawling. The nights got worse. I began hearing whispers in the walls, just on the edge of understanding. Sometimes my name, sometimes laughter. I woke up one night to find the old key sitting on my nightstand, though I had locked it in a drawer. Another night, I found muddy footprints on the stairs leading from the basement up to the second floor. They stopped outside my bedroom door. The breaking point came 2 months after moving in. I woke to find myself standing in the basement. I don't know how I got there. I don't sleepwalk, never have. The air was damp and freezing, and when I turned, I saw something in the far corner. A figure, not fully solid, but dark, shifting like smoke. It didn't move toward me, but I felt it watching. I ran. I don't remember climbing the stairs or unlocking the door, only that I ended up outside in the yard, gasping for air. The house loomed behind me, silent, the windows like black eyes. That morning, I packed a bag and left. I stayed at a motel for a week while trying to figure out what to do. Every time I thought about going back, dread weighed on me like a stone. Finally, I put the house back on the market. I didn't care about the money I'd lose. I just needed out. Even now, months later, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, certain I hear those footsteps again. I'll lie in bed in my new apartment, heart pounding, and swear I feel that draft against my skin. I never went back for most of my things. The movers I hired to retrieve the furniture said the basement door was wide open when they arrived, though I hadn't left it that way. They asked if I wanted the old key they found sitting on the stairs. I told them no. I don't think I ever want to see that house again. Story the end.